Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku became every villain's worst nightmare? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Izuku couldn't breathe. Sorry, kid. The sludge villain squeezed a little tighter. I didn't know All Might was in town. I can't afford to stick around. Izuku's vision started going dark and he clawed uselessly at the villain. This was really it, wasn't it? He was going to die. Reluctantly, he stopped fighting, slowly giving into fear and dread as the rest of his air ran out. Detroit. Smash. Izuku heard a terrified scream from the villain before he passed out, and the next thing he knew he was getting slapped awake by All Might. All Might? Izuku sat straight up. You saved me? Of course you saved me. I don't thank you for saving me. I have a notebook. Will you please? All Might gave a booming laugh and handed him his notebook. Already done, my boy. My apologies for letting you get caught by that villain. Back in the day, he would never have even reached the sewers. Now if you'll excuse me, I must be on my way. Wait. Izuku reached toward him. I have so much to ask. Kaken was right. Izuku was an idiot. He'd realized that All Might was about to launch off, but he'd grabbed onto his leg anyway. He knew how far All Might could jump. He knew every statistic there was on him. He knew how dangerous that was. Why in the world had he done that? As soon as he noticed Izuku, All Might started shaking his leg. Come on, kid, I get being a fan, but this is too much. Izuku clung on even tighter. If I let go now, I'll die. Oh, All Might blinked like he hadn't even thought about that and grabbed Izuku's collar. Just close your mouth and eyes, kid. You look gross. Izuku did as he was told, and after a few seconds, he felt a jolt as All Might landed. Immediately, all the terror-fueled strength he hadn't known had left him and he collapsed onto the ground. I'm alive. Barely. All Might huffed. What was so important that you did something so stupid, kid? Izuku pulled himself to his feet. I needed to ask you a question. Well, kid, out with it. All Might prodded. I don't have all day, you know. Izuku took a deep breath. It's just that my whole life, I've wanted to be a hero, but everybody says I can't. So, is it possible that even though I'm quirkless, can I be a hero like you? Sometime while he was talking, smoke started filling the rooftop, and by the time he gathered his courage to look, All Might was gone. Izuku screamed. It's still me, kid, don't be so dramatic. All Might groaned and lifted up his shirt to show Izuku a large scar. This is a scary career, kid. You fight powerful villains head-on long enough and well, this injury was just one guy. So can you be a hero, kid? Not without a quirk. All Might kept talking, but Izuku was too focused on holding back his tears to hear any of it. At some point, All Might pushed past him, and after that, there was really no point in staying, so Izuku forced himself to get moving. He'd really just been lying to himself all these years, hadn't he? Izuku didn't really know where he was going. Probably home, since there was no point in going to the villain fight he could hear going on in the distance, now that his notes were useless. If even All Might said it was impossible, then it was true. He couldn't be a hero. What was he going to do now? He was so wrapped up in his thoughts that he almost didn't hear the commotion in the alleyway. It wasn't nearly as loud as the fight in the distance, but it was still enough to get his attention. Now that he was paying attention, Izuku could hear punches being landed and someone yelling about a villain, and before he knew it, he was walking toward the fight on autopilot. It must be a minor villain, probably with a weaker quirk. The ones with stronger quirks usually drew a crowd, and most of the heroes were probably at the other fight, so even if he was still going to be a hero, there really wasn't any point in watching. He found himself rushing to the alley anyway, only to skid to a stop as he realized it wasn't a villain fight at all. A group of kids his own age was clumped around a few ringleaders, who were either pinning down or beating up their current victim, a lanky kid with purple hair, and well, it was most likely a verbal quirk, considering that the bullies were bothering to cover his mouth. If it had been Izuku, Kaken would have just let him scream. Why are you even thinking of applying for UA? One of the ringleaders sneered. You're a villain and that's what you'll always be. Why would a school like UA even think of letting someone like you be a hero? So the kid had a villain's quirk. Izuku winced sympathetically. That was pretty much as bad as being quirkless in a lot of people's eyes. Somebody landed a punch to the kid's gut and he let out a muffled grunt. Izuku couldn't help himself. He'd stood between Kaken and the other kids so many times that his feet moved on their own and he took 2 steps forward until the kid saw him. Instead of looking at him with hope or gratefulness, though, the kid just shook his head sternly and shook his head. Izuku froze. One of the bullies snarled, "What are you looking at, villain?" Izuku ducked behind a dumpster as the bully turned his head. The kid obviously didn't want him interfering, not that Izuku could do much good anyway, but still. After a few seconds, he peeked out, but made sure to keep to the shadows as much as he could so he wouldn't be seen. The bullies were looking around nervously and even though they'd turned back to the kid, they had obviously been thrown off their rhythm. Interesting. Do you think he somehow called for one of his villain friends? One of the lackeys hissed. What are we gonna do if he calls for backup? He didn't call for backup. A ringleader insisted, but Izuku noted with surprise that he didn't believe it. The villain doesn't have any friends to come help him in the first place. Izuku frowned. He at least had Kaken, even though he wasn't quite sure if that counted as friendship, but from the sound of it, this kid didn't have any friends at all. That must be so lonely. There must be something he could do to help. The bullies were still nervous and a couple had started shifting like they were about to bolt. Izuku had to stop himself before he started muttering. They were that thrown off just by the suggestion that backup was coming? What were they so afraid of? Was it just that they didn't know what might come? If they knew who was hiding, they wouldn't be scared at all, so that fear of the unknown must be part of it. What if they thought he had a strong quirk? Would they be more scared or less? One of the bullies glanced around the alley before huffing and shoving the kid to the ground. Whatever, I was getting bored anyway. Don't even bother applying to UA, villain. The kid glared after them and Izuku ducked back behind the dumpster as they stalked out of the alley. He waited until the last one was gone before running toward the kid. Hey, are you okay? The kid rolled his eyes. Just peachy. Oh, I have a first aid kit. Izuku swung his bag off his shoulder and started digging through it. I have badges and burn cream and... Don't bother. I have my own. The kid was already kneeling next to his own backpack and within a second he'd pulled out a first aid kit just as intense as Izuku's. So, you're obviously pretty beat up too. What do they hate you for? Oh, Izuku's face fell. I'm quirkless. All of a sudden, Izuku's brain felt fuzzy and his arms fell limply at his sides, his fingers barely managing to hang onto the strap of his backpack. The kid refused to look at him as he started bandaging his bruises. Go away. Izuku couldn't say he was very surprised when his body started obeying on its own. Brainwashing would explain why the other kids were calling him a villain and why they were covering his mouth, since it seemed to activate with a question. That was such a cool quirk. He really hoped that kid ignored his bullies and tried for UA anyway because he would be able to save so many people someday. It took a few blocks to qualify as a way enough for the quirk to deactivate, and the moment he had his brain back, Izuku sighed in defeat. There was no point in turning around and trying to find the kid again, he was probably long gone by now, but Izuku had ended up wandering in the direction of the other villain fight, so he might as well stop by there now. It didn't take him long at all to find the crowd, but instead of catching the tail end of the cleanup, the fight was still going on. That must be one strong villain. How long has that kid been in there? I dunno, but if he's still alive, he hasn't got long. The villain had a hostage? What was the villain's quirk? Was it something with fire or... Izuku finally elbowed his way through enough of the crowd to be able to see the villain and he gasped. The sludge villain must have escaped the bottles that All Might shoved him in. This was his fault. If he hadn't grabbed onto All Might, he wouldn't have dropped the bottles, and even if for some reason he had, then he would have still had just enough time left to recapture him. Izuku cursed himself and pushed a little closer. Was the hostage even still alive? Izuku had felt like he was going to die after only a few seconds. The hostage was struggling weakly at this point, but considering all the fires the heroes were fighting, he must have some sort of fire quirk. Izuku leaned forward as he saw a tiny bit of flame burst from one of the victim's hands and it was an explosion. Kaken! Izuku yelled and almost started running before he caught himself. That kid earlier was right. If he went out there right now, he'd just be an extra victim for the heroes to save, but there had to be something he could do. All Might wasn't coming, he was all out of energy for the day, but well, actually the villain didn't know that, did he? In spite of himself, Izuku smiled. The sludge villain was terrified of All Might, just like those bullies had been scared of him when he'd hidden behind the dumpster. Well, more scared of the idea of him, but still that they'd given up rather than risk fighting against an enemy they couldn't beat. A half-baked plan already in mind, Izuku took a big breath and yelled at the top of his lungs, "All Might's at a fight just down the street. He'll be here any minute." The crowd started chanting All Might's name and the villain instantly tensed, torn between taking over his hostage, who wouldn't be a very good disguise at this point, and making a run for it. Izuku elbowed his way to the very front of the crowd. He just needed to give one final push. The villain was looking around frantically for All Might, so it didn't take long for his eyes to widen in recognition as he spotted Izuku in the crowd. Izuku gave his best, most confident smile as he called out, "Well? Do you really think you can escape the #1 hero again? Really?" The villain hesitated for one final second before expelling Kaken onto the pavement with a squelch and making a run for it. The heroes rushed him instantly, no longer having to avoid hurting Kaken or risk getting caught in one of his explosions, and it didn't take long before the sludge villain was once again in custody. Izuku weaved his way back through the crowd before Kaken could see him and made his way home deep in thought. He'd asked All Might if a quirkless kid could be a hero like him, and the answer he got was true. Izuku would never be like All Might, he wouldn't be able to bring hope the way the symbol of peace was, but he thought back the way the bullies and the villain had run away. Maybe he could be another kind of hero instead. Hitoshi reapplied the bandages from a few days ago, even though the cuts were almost healed by now. His bullies had laid off him for the moment, too scared that his mysterious backup would pop out of the shadows at any moment. Hitoshi knew better than to expect that to last forever, especially once they figured out that the guy they were so afraid of was actually just a quirkless kid from another school who had his own bullies to worry about. Still, the break was nice while it lasted. Hitoshi stretched and climbed into bed to browse his phone until he felt tired enough to sleep. His foster parents didn't really care what he did when he had insomnia as long as he was quiet and didn't leave his room. But then again, the quiet rule had been pretty much constant since he turned 4, so it wasn't that bad. At least he didn't have to worry about sharing a room, even if it stung a little that the other kids would rather let him have the attic to himself rather than share a room with the villain. Once his current fosters realized a roommate wasn't going to work, they'd cleaned out the tiny space above the garage and shoved him there to make room for the other kids. Half the walls were bare plywood and it was miserably hot in the summer, but Hitoshi couldn't complain. At least he had a window in the roof so he could watch the stars when he inevitably got bored of his phone. It was cloudy tonight, but he glanced up anyway to see what constellations were out, then promptly scrambled out of bed, barely stifling a scream as he glimpsed a shadow, a human-shaped shadow, peering through his window. Hitoshi was half convinced he'd imagined it, until the shadow knocked. Hitoshi seriously considered just making a run for his life, never mind what his foster parents would say before stealing his courage and reaching for his phone. He turned on the flashlight and shone it toward the window. It was probably nothing, right? Just a raccoon or maybe a tree branch, even though there weren't any trees near his window. Still, there was no point getting in trouble for a false alarm. When he saw that it was the kid from the alley, Hitoshi could only blink in bewilderment. The kid gave him a bright smile as he waved. Through his window. On his roof. "What the?" Hitoshi breathed. "Hi Shinso." The kid's voice was slightly muffled through the glass. "Let me in." Hitoshi's curiosity won out over his intelligence, and before he knew it, he'd reached out and unlatched the window. The kid tumbled onto his bed with a quiet thump and ruffled his curls, which did absolutely nothing to make them more presentable, before looking up. "Thanks. I'm Izuku Midoriya, by the way. I don't think I ever got around to mentioning that the other day. I thought I told you to go away." Hitoshi said blankly. "Oh, you did?" Midoriya nodded agreeably. You have a really cool quirk, by the way. You're gonna be able to do so many awesome things with it. So why are you here? Hitoshi could feel a migraine coming on. Actually, back up, how are you here? I didn't even tell you my name. Oh well, Midoriya looked almost embarrassed. I actually started with your uniform? My uniform? Hitoshi did a double take. Wait, started? Midoriya nodded. Well, I know. There's a lot of schools that use the same uniform, so I looked at what time they ended and crossed off the ones that were within walking distance of where we met. Then I scanned through the websites of ones left because at least at my school the bullies are ones with the strongest quirks and end up getting featured a lot, so I figured I might be able to find one of yours. Once I'd found your school, I dug a little deeper and figured out it's your last year too, but I couldn't find what class you were in or what your name was, so I just kinda asked around about a kid with a verbal activation quirk, threw out 90% of the rumors, figured out what your name was and used that to find you. Hitoshi stared at Midoriya, who was looking at him expectantly. That's kinda creepy. To his surprise, Midoriya grinned. I know. Isn't it great? Hitoshi raised an eyebrow. No. Okay, well, not traditionally, but Midoriya bit his lip. You want to be a hero, right? Hitoshi nodded hesitantly. I'm going to go to you. Are you here to stop me? No. Midoriya clapped a hand over his mouth as he realized how loud he'd been. No, I actually want to be a hero too, so I was kinda hoping we could help each other? Any maybe be, like, hero partners? Because, well. Hitoshi gestured for him to continue. Because what? Because you think hanging around the villain will make you less of a target? No, Midoriya puffed his cheeks out in frustration. It's just, let's face it, neither of us is ever going to be the kind of hero that brings people hope. Kids like us can't be heroes like All Might. Maybe you can't. Hitoshi snarled. But I'm gonna prove them all wrong and be. Midoriya waved his hands frantically. No, we can't be heroes like All Might, but we can be different. You've seen how much prejudice there is. You've got a villain quirk, Shinso, and I'm quirkless. Even if a few of the more open-minded civilians decide to trust us, there's still going to be a lot of people who are never going to be willing to see past our quirks. Hitoshi huffed. Ouch. Great pep talk. Real inspiring. Let me finish. Midoriya said. We might not be the kind of heroes that can make civilians think, oh, thank God we're saved, when we arrive at the scene. So what if instead, we become the kind of heroes that make villains think, oh, we're screwed. Midoriya's expression had morphed into a sly smile, but Hitoshi hung back. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm saying that we don't have to bring hope if we can weaponize fear. People are already afraid of you. Midoriya said. And they're either freaked out by me or think I'm weak. I think we can use that to our advantage. We're never going to be very popular, but we can still save people. Hitoshi was silent for a long moment. You're insane. Midoriya's face fell, but Hitoshi was too busy thinking through everything he'd just heard to comfort him. Fear tactics were normally associated with villains, but so was brainwashing. Not to mention that fear had been just enough to keep his bullies off his back for a few days. So yeah, Midoriya's idea was crazy, but oddly enough, it was so crazy it just might work. Plus, it wasn't like he had literally anything else going for him. Sure, I'm down. Let's do it. Hitoshi said finally, making Midoriya do a double take. But that still doesn't explain what you're doing in my house in the middle of the night. Do you know how much trouble I could get in if my foster parents caught you? I was going to wait until tomorrow and find you after school. Midoriya insisted, blushing. But I got too excited. He at least had the good grace to look sheepish, and in spite of himself, Hitoshi smiled and shook his head. Yep, you're insane. Midoriya grinned hesitantly. Guess I'll take that as a compliment. Mom fretted in the doorway as Izuku organized his notes and papers so that Shinso wouldn't be too overwhelmed when he arrived. Thankfully, he didn't seem like the type who scared too easily, or else Izuku would have already ruined all chances for their friendship. Partnership? Whatever it was before it even began. It wasn't his fault that he got so excited. It hadn't even occurred to him that Shinso might not be nearly as excited as he was about using fear to become a different kind of hero. To Izuku, the realization felt like it had completely turned the world on its head. Becoming a hero like All Might had always felt like an impossible mountain he needed to climb, and every person who called him weak or useless, just because he didn't have a quirk, was yet another boulder that he needed to scramble over just to find the path, not to mention actually climbing the mountain. Once he stopped worrying about being liked, though, it was like someone had taken dynamite to the road and blown all the boulders to shreds. It was still an uphill battle, but now it was doable. If he didn't have to be liked, then all that he had to do was be hated, and Izuku had plenty of experience with that. For the first time in his life, I'm going to be a hero felt less like a dream and more like a promise, and even if it was a little selfish, he really hoped that Shinso felt the same way. It would be a lot easier to be a hero if he actually had someone rooting for him. The doorbell rang and Izuku leapt to his feet. "I'll get it." Mom pursed her lips as he pushed past her, and Izuku felt a pang of guilt. She was always a bit disappointed whenever he got a renewed sense of hero fervor, and he was pretty sure that she was secretly hoping that he'd come home one day and announce that he'd decided on a more sensible, safer career. However much he hated worrying her, though, he hated the idea of being useless even more, so hopefully she'd at least be proud of him. Shinso looked bored when Izuku opened the door, but his stance was guarded, so Izuku suspected that it was an intentional move, kind of like how Izuku sometimes smiled to hide how nervous he was. Izuku grinned brightly and grabbed Shinso's arm. If he was feeling anxious, then Izuku would just have to show him that there was nothing to be nervous about. "Come on in. I've been waiting for you." Shinso didn't say anything, but he did nod and take off his shoes, so Izuku kept rambling to fill the silence. "My room is this way. I hope you don't mind that I've kind of been getting a head start on some research." Shinso was already starting to lose a little bit of his bored expression. "Research?" Izuku shrugged. "Like tactics and strategy, you know? Like how fear tactics have been used in the past. Some of them obviously rely on a lot of violence, so those aren't really something we want in our arsenal, but we should still know they exist, and maybe we can find a way to modify them to fit our goals a little better." Shinso raised an eyebrow. "So basically you've been studying villains." Izuku blushed. "Not just villains." "Good." Shinso smirked. "How else are we supposed to scare them out of their minds if we don't know what they're used to? I like the idea of turning their own tricks against them. It's like intentional karma." Izuku blinked. I hadn't thought of it like that." Izuku?" Mom said softly. "Is this your friend?" "Yeah." Izuku stepped to the side so she could see him better. "This is Shinso." Shinso gave her a little wave, and Izuku realized he was probably used to introducing himself silently so that he didn't make anyone uncomfortable with his quirk. Izuku understood. He didn't often introduce his quirk at first because he was afraid of how people would react, but he didn't have to worry about people getting scared, just hostile. He just wished that Mom hadn't looked so grateful that Shinso stayed quiet. He probably shouldn't have told her about Shinso's quirk, but when he'd said that he was inviting a friend over, she'd wanted to know everything about him. Izuku had, as usual, gotten too excited and started rambling about how cool Shinso's quirk was, because it was, and how it was going to be so useful when they were heroes. It wasn't until he saw the terrified look on her face that he realized she might see Shinso as a threat and not an ally. Instantly, he started being more vague, but the damage had already been done. At least he'd managed to convince her to let him come over still, but realistically he knew that Mom only allowed it so that she could supervise them instead of letting Izuku go off to meet with his dangerous new friend somewhere where she couldn't protect him. It wasn't fair, but Izuku was going to become just as dangerous as Shinso was and prove that he didn't need her protection. They were going to be amazing heroes. Mom smiled nervously at Shinso and turned back to Izuku. Well, keep the door open and I'll be out here if you need anything, baby. Anything at all. Just yell." "Okay." Izuku's heart sank. "Got it." Mom nodded and stepped aside so that she wasn't blocking the hallway. Izuku didn't say anything else as he led Shinso to his room and closed the door as much as possible so that it was just barely cracked open. He grimaced and turned to Shinso. "I am so sorry." Shinso shrugged. "My foster parents are the same way, don't worry about it." I mean, we're trying to turn that fear to our advantage, right? That's kinda the whole idea. Izuku frowned and went to his desk. I guess so. Okay, here's everything I've got so far. Where do you want to start? Toshinori was a little overwhelmed at the moment. He wasn't ready to retire yet. There were still so many people to save and the world still needed a symbol of peace. Sure, Nedzu had pointed out that teaching wasn't really a retirement, but Toshinori still felt like he was being forced away from the front lines. He had to face the truth, All Might was past his prime. Still, retirement or no, Toshinori knew that he wouldn't be able to really rest until he had found a successor. One for All was a sacred power and the next symbol of peace would be able to care for the world in his place, so it was his responsibility to nurture their progression and encourage them to become the shining pinnacle of justice he had once been. The only issue was, well, finding the perfect successor. Toshinori put his vibrating phone back in his pocket, deciding to let Nitai's call go to voicemail. It was impossible to tell whether he was calling about One for All or about Toshinori's new job at UAT. Well, maybe it wasn't impossible, but that would require actually picking up the phone and talking to him, so it was out of the question. Whatever conversation Night-Eye wanted, Toshinori wasn't ready to have it yet. For now, he needed to focus on finding his elusive successor. He could always wait until classes started at UA and have his pick from among the elite students there, but he couldn't help feeling anxious to find the next symbol of peace as soon as humanly possible. If he could find a first year before they entered UA, then there was a chance they'd be able to receive One for All before classes even started. Yes, that would be the best-case scenario. He wished he knew who had somehow gotten the sludge villain to run the other day. He had been standing in the crowd cursing himself when the cry went out that All Might was just down the street, so he knew it had been a ruse, but somehow, it had been just enough to get the villain to drop the hostage, which was more than any of the heroes present had accomplished. The child that had started the cry undoubtedly had a good head for strategy and would likely make a good successor, but no one had been able to tell who exactly had been the one to set the plan in motion, so there was no way for Toshinori to find them. Toshinori was obviously a little disappointed, but the child would undoubtedly become a great hero on their own merit someday, so he couldn't afford to spend too much time worrying about it. He just needed to find someone with a good heart and a strong enough will that. Toshinori stumbled as he ran into someone, knocking them to the ground. He'd been too wrapped up in his thoughts. He shouldn't have gotten so distracted, some hero he was. He bent over to help the man up. Oh, I'm so sorry. I wasn't watching where I was going, this is all my fault. You think? A young lady glared at him as she practically pushed him out of the way to help the man up. Are you okay, Dad? The man laughed and rolled his shoulder. I'm fine. You're stronger than you look, man. Thank you. Toshinori said nervously. Again, I am so sorry. You better be. The young lady hadn't stopped glaring at him. You could have hurt him, especially if you've got a strength quirk. Watch where you're going next time. Don't be rude, Kyoka, he already apologized. The man smiled. My name is Kyoto Kujiro, and this is my daughter Kyokajiro. And seriously, don't sweat it, I'm just fine. Well, that's good to hear. Toshinori said. It's admirable that you are so concerned about your father's safety, young lady. Well, somebody has to be. Young Jiro muttered. Goodness knows he doesn't care about it enough. Kyoto laughed and ruffled her hair. Well, that's what I have you for, my little hero. And soon enough the entire world is gonna see it. Once you get into you. Jiro pushed him away. Stop it, Dad. You're so embarrassing. Toshinori perked up. You're going to UA? I have to pass the entrance exam first. Jiro huffed. But, yeah, that's the plan. Toshinori considered his next move carefully. This young lady was a bit rough around the edges, but she had an inner fire and protectiveness that reminded him of Nana. She would make a wonderful hero and, with some training, she had the potential to be an amazing symbol of peace too. He also couldn't deny that a 10-month head start would give her a huge advantage over if he waited until school began, and since she already had that drive to be a hero, he nodded firmly, mind made up. I have considerable experience working with heroes. In fact, I've worked at All Might's agency for almost my entire career. Toshinori smiled softly. I'd be happy to help train you for the entrance exam, if you'd like. Really? Kyotoku's eyes widened. Well, Kyoka? What are you waiting for? This is the opportunity of a lifetime. You know what I always say, never turn down an adventure. Say yes. Jiro just ignored her father and looked at Toshinori skeptically. And what would this training look like? Muscle training, mostly. Toshinori answered, a bit thrown off. And quirk training. Who knows, with enough training, your quirk might develop into something else entirely. I have other resources that, if you choose to accept them, will set you on the path to becoming one of the greatest heroes in the world. Jiro frowned for another long moment and Toshinori was terrified she was going to say no until she shrugged. Well, it's not like I have another training plan right now, but this had better be worth it, okay? If not, I'm dropping you. Toshinori blinked in shock. Oh, of course, that sounds reasonable. Jiro nodded and her father instantly wrapped an arm around both of them. Ah, my little girl's gonna be a hero. Dad? Jiro blushed. I'm not a little girl anymore. Toshinori smiled. The girl knew how to stand up for herself. He had a feeling he'd made the right choice. It felt like Kaken was getting worse. Maybe Izuku was imagining it, but ever since he'd gotten captured by the sludge villain, Kaken was about twice as mean as he had been. He must be compensating for being caught as the victim and trying to regain either a sense of control or a sense of power, but in the end, it didn't matter what had led to the change, it just mattered that Izuku stayed out of his attack radius as much as humanly possible. That wasn't an option during class, unfortunately, especially since most of his teachers would turn a blind eye to Izuku getting tripped, burned, or hurt if it meant that Kaken wouldn't interrupt class. But after class was when the worst beatings happened anyway, so if he could just stay out of sight for long enough for Kaken to leave, then Izuku could go hang out with Shinso at the park. He just had to stay out of sight. Izuku looked around for somewhere to hide. Inside a locker would be fine if he had a guarantee that he could get out, but if the locker latched and he got trapped, then it would defeat the whole purpose of hiding in the first place. Empty classrooms weren't a safe bet because Kaken would send his lackeys to check those, and if he tried going to a teacher it would just make things worse. If only there were some way to give himself an advantage and take the high ground. Izuku almost stopped in his tracks as it hit him. Take the high ground. Sure, Katsuki could easily reach him with his explosions, but that was only if he thought to look up. Izuku sped up and skidded around the corner, making a beeline for the trophy case. Kaken had won pretty much every award the school offered, so his name and face were featured multiple times, while Izuku may as well not be a student. That didn't matter though, what mattered was that the case didn't go all the way to the ceiling. There was about a foot of space on top with a little decorative lip along the edge of the case that should be enough to mostly hide him if he laid down completely flat. Izuku grabbed a chair from an empty classroom and used it to try and scramble up the side of the case, accidentally kicking it aside as he did. It took all of his strength to get up on top of it, but he finally managed it with a grunt. It was hard to catch his breath with all the dust, so he covered his mouth and did his best to muffle how hard he was panting. This entire plan would be for nothing if Kaken heard him and found his hiding place. It was only a few seconds after Izuku had settled in that Kaken and a couple of their other classmates rounded the corner. Kaken had a murderous expression on his face as he looked down the hallway in both directions. You extras split up and find that dim nerd. I'm gonna take a look around here. His lackeys nodded and one took off in either direction while Kaken started looking around. He peeked his head in each of the other classrooms and Izuku had to fight off disappointment when he didn't look at any of them for more than a few seconds. Then Kaken saw the chair on the floor and his eyes narrowed. Izuku couldn't help himself as he started trembling. If Kaken found him, was there anything he could even do? If he was just stronger, then he could have gotten up quicker and not had to use the chair. He shouldn't have left any evidence that Kaken could use to find him. Hiding had seemed like the perfect plan at the time, but if it didn't work, then it would just make everything worse. He needed to get better at thinking ahead and strategizing for every possibility, not just the one he hoped would happen. Stupid dust. If he was going to be hiding in places like this frequently, he'd need to start carrying around a mask. Kaken was getting closer and Izuku clamped his hands over his mouth again as he felt a sneeze coming on. He hated this. He hated being so terrified. And as much as he hated it, what made it even worse was that Kaken didn't even know what it was like. With the exception of the sludge villain, he'd never been the victim. He didn't know what it was like to live in fear like Izuku did. His mind was racing through all the research he'd done since meeting Shinso, and Izuku knew that there were 1.5 million strategies that he could use, but if he tried them and failed, then it would just make Kaken even more angry than he was right now. Plus there was the fact that Izuku was pretty sure that Kaken's fight or flight response was mostly geared toward fight, which meant that a fake-out strategy wasn't going to work here like it did with the sludge villain. What was he supposed to do? Kaken's eyes slid from the chair to the trophy case to Izuku on top. He gulped. Too late. There you are, Deku. Kaken smirked. Found you. Kyoko wasn't quite sure what to think of her new teacher. Dad was always so gung-ho about taking advantage of new opportunities and never saying no to an adventure, but he was also impulsive and had a habit of not thinking things through all the way. So yeah, Dad saw absolutely nothing sketchy about some guy who supposedly worked for All Might offering to train her, but Kyoko was obviously picking up more than a few red flags that merited bringing pepper spray along to her first training session. If Tashinori Yagi hadn't been listed as an employee on All Might's website, she wouldn't have even shown up at all, but a little extra training from someone who actually knew the hero industry would be extremely valuable, so even though she was still pretty sure he was lying about something, she had decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. For now. Dagobah Municipal Beach Park. When Yagi had told her the meeting place, she'd been expecting more. Well, just more. The park, if she could even call it that, was so disused that people had started using it as a public dump site, and if there had ever been a playground anywhere sound here, it had long since been buried beneath literal mountains of trash. Yagi, of course, blended right in, so it took her a minute to realize that he'd beaten her there and was already standing on the boardwalk, looking out over the ocean. Kyoko wrinkled her nose and winced at every minuscule creak the wood made as she started picking her way to him. No offense, but this perfect training ground you picked is kind of a mess. Yagi jumped and gave her a sheepish smile. Oh, young Jiro. I didn't see you there. Jiro gave him a skeptical look. So, are we gonna train or what? Yes. Of course. Yagi snapped into action and started making his way back to the beach with much less care than she had taken, most likely because he couldn't hear every concerning creak the wood made as they put weight on it, but they somehow managed to reach the sand without the boardwalk collapsing underneath them. Kyoko breathed a sigh of relief. This was definitely turning out to be an adventure. So, young Jiro, Yagi began, leading her through the piles of trash, I must admit that I haven't been completely honest with you. His form started to shift and Kyoko cursed under her breath and grabbed the can of pepper spray in her pocket. Go on an adventure, Dad said. It'll be a great opportunity, he said. Kyoko swore to God if she got murdered she was going to haunt her father for the rest of his miserable life. She had no idea what kind of quick this guy had, but from the shift in size, it was most likely some kind of monster quirk. She wasn't equipped to fight that. What could she do? Yagi had already lured her out of sight of the street, but they were still close enough that if she pepper sprayed him and bolted, she might just be able to get away before he recovered. She braced her feet, and as soon as the smoke had cleared enough for her to tell where the creature's eyes were, she fired. Bullseye. The smoke surrounding Yagi finished clearing and Kyoka's eyes widened as she realized just who exactly she had just pepper sprayed right in the eyes right as he let out a strangled cry and collapsed back into his skeletal form with a puff of steam. All Might. Yes. All Might coughed up a small amount of blood, making Kyoka feel even worse. I knew you were, strong enough for my quirk. Where's my phone? Here, call Recovery Girl. Jiro was shaking as she grabbed his phone out of his hand and searched through the contacts. Thankfully, there weren't that many and Recovery Girl was already near the top of his recent calls. Hello? I think I might have just attacked the #1 hero. Sorry? Hitoshi was trying really hard to not feel betrayed. After going over to Midoriya's house, he'd thought that they were at least partners, if not friends, but here he was. At the meeting place. Alone. Midoriya really didn't strike him as the type of guy to be late, so at this point, it was probably safe to assume that he wasn't showing up at all. Maybe he'd wanted to show up and his mom just hadn't let him? That was probably just wishful thinking. It would have been nice if Midoriya still wanted to hang out with him, but he'd probably come to his senses and realized that the whole using fear as a weapon and being associated with someone with a villain's quirk was kind of a bad idea in the first place. Even if it ended up working, it was still a long shot. Hitsuhai sighed and jumped off the swing he'd been sitting on. He might as well go home and do his homework. He needed to at least make sure he could pass the Gen Ed exam once it was time to apply to UA. He shouldn't have gotten his hopes up. Shinso! Midoriya's voice made him stop in his tracks. Sorry I'm late. I got held up, but I'm here now. Hitoshi looked Midoriya up and down. He was slightly favoring one ankle and his uniform was singed and torn in several places. Plus, Hitoshi was fairly certain that those were bandages peeking out from his sleeves. Held up by who? Muggers. No, Midoriya rubbed the back of his neck. Just some bullies. I really wish I could just make them go away. I mean, I know how, right? But all the study we've done is just in theory. I've never really had a chance to practice being scary, you know? And I've only ever practiced being less scary. Hitoshi nodded in understanding. So, what are we gonna do about that? There's gotta be some way for us to practice. Midoriya had started muttering to himself, so Hitoshi just let him talk and tried to catch as much as possible. There are haunted houses, but while those might be helpful, they probably won't hire kids our age. Wait, aren't there companies that provide civilians for rescue simulations and stuff for heroes in training? I wonder if there's opportunities like that for fake villains. If there is, that'd probably be the best. Hitoshi cut in. I mean, the point is to beat the villains at their own game, right? So pretending to be villains would probably be a pretty effective way to practice. Midoriya smiled and pulled out his phone. Okay, let's start there. We'll probably need a lot more physical training too, and maybe parkour? It seems like it'll be really useful to be able to beat villains in mobility and, I kinda tried hiding on top of a display case and rolled my ankle jumping down. Hitoshi raised an eyebrow. Was this before or after you got beat up? Midoriya grimaced. Before. And that reminds me, we should probably learn to fight. Yeah. Hitoshi nodded. Yeah, we should probably get on that. Hitoshi crossed yet another company off their list as Izuku dialed the net number. Think it's time we start looking into some plan BS. Yeah. Izuku sighed as the phone rang on speaker. I was hoping this would work out, but it's looking like it's not going to. The phone stopped ringing and Izuku scrambled as a voice answered on the other end. Hello, you've reached the Help Us company, HUC for short. How can I help you today? Yes, hello. Izuku said brightly. Your company provides civilians for hero training exercises, right? Yes, that would be correct. The receptionist replied. That's actually the entire point of our company. And do you ever provide other services? Shinso asked. Like villains for things like that? Not normally, the receptionist hummed. The Hero Commission normally prefers to have heroes fill those roles when possible. May I know why you're asking? You seem a little young to be hiring our services. Yeah, a little. Izuku grimaced. We're looking more along the lines of employment opportunities? We're going to be trying for hero schools this next year. Shinso clarified. So we were hoping to volunteer as villains and get some actual combat experience. That would give you an edge. The receptionist said. But unfortunately, like I said, we don't really provide that series, and even if we did, we have an age limit of at least 16 for our employees. There's a possibility to let me is it alright if I put you on hold real quick? Yeah, sure. Izuku frowned and turned to Shinso as jazzy hold music filled the room. Well, that's not promising? Shinso shrugged, more than the other places that just politely laughed in our faces. Izuku nodded in agreement and was about to say something else when the hold music suddenly cut out. All right, are you still there? Yeah. We are, Shinso said. What do you have for us? Well, it's not a guarantee, but our company has been contracted to be the civilians for an upcoming training exercise, and I believe they are looking for villains as well. The receptionist said. However, they might also have an age requirement just like we do. Izuku hurried and reached for the notebook that Shinso was practically shoving into his hands. That's better than nothing. Do you know where we can find out more? I can give you a link. The receptionist giggled. I'm glad to see you two are taking the initiative. That will be really helpful when you're heroes. Izuku's jaw dropped and he looked at Shinso, who he could tell was having the exact same thought process. When they were heroes. Not if. They were going to be heroes. After a moment too long, he shook his head. Yes. Yes, please. Thank you so much. This is your own demon fault, All Might. Recovery Girl complained. Seriously, what were you thinking? Cornering a young lady like that? Honestly, I almost wish she'd done more than just blind you, because maybe then you would actually learn your lesson. Kyoka sat awkwardly on the examination bed in the UA nurse's office, twisting her earphones between her fingers as Yagi, no, All Might, stood at the eye wash station getting chewed out by the oldest hero Kyoka had ever seen. This was an adventure, for I still feel bad. Kyoka fretted. I shouldn't have. Oh no, dearie, it isn't your fault that Yagi killed all his brain cells years ago. Recovery Girl assured her. You have absolutely nothing to be sorry for. All Might here was acting like a creep, and you responded accordingly. As far as I'm concerned, you were more of a hero in this situation than he was. Do I make myself clear? Kyoka blinked in shock for a moment, then found herself smiling. Yes, ma'am. It's not my fault that All Might is an idiot. All Might sputtered as Recovery Girl laughed proudly. Oh, I like this one. You chose yourself a good successor, All Might. I'm almost tempted to say you might actually have some sense. Kyoka frowned. What did she mean by successor? And earlier, right after she'd sprayed him, All Might had said she was strong enough for his quirk, whatever that meant. At the time, Kyoka had been a little too preoccupied with not accidentally killing the #1 hero to worry too much about it, but even after things had calmed down a little bit, Kyoka was used to overhearing things that she wasn't supposed to. Overhearing people's secrets was the worst part of having a hearing quirk, but it was something she'd had to get used to, so Jiro had just filed All Might's weird comment away as one of those mysteries she would never have an answer to. Usually, however, those mysteries had nothing to do with her, and keeping a secret about her from her was decidedly less okay. What are you talking about? I'm not All Might's successor. He just offered some training sessions to help me get ahead before UA. Or at least, that's all he told me. Recovery Girl shook her head and hit All Might's knees with her cane. You didn't tell her? Of all the harebrained, idiotic. I was getting around to it. All Might insisted. If you hadn't noticed, our original meeting was interrupted. Jiro put her foot down. What are you two talking about? If you're just going to argue and not actually tell me, then I'm leaving. I'm not going to waste my time sticking around with people who aren't even willing to be honest with me. Recovery Girl glared at All Might, who looked as contrite as he could with his eyes still somewhat swollen from the pepper spray. We are referring to my quirk, young Jiro. It is called One for All and I would like you to inherit it. Hitoshi stared at the screen, his jaw on the floor as he recognized the logo. I think the HUC receptionist forgot to mention that this was an exercise for you. No, this is even better. Midoriya nodded like he was trying to reassure himself. This way, we can show our skills and abilities even before the entrance exam and make a more memorable first impression. We just thought we just need to be such good villains that they realize they need us on their side. This'll work. This'll work. Hitoshi raised one eyebrow skeptically. You're basically planning on scaring UA into thinking we'll become villains if we don't become heroes? Well. Midoriya smiled sheepishly. We are trying to incite fear. Is there an age limit? Hitoshi leaned over to read some of the text. There's no point in getting our hopes up and planning on this thing if they won't even let us participate. Midoriya quickly scrolled through the page, muttering unintelligibly to himself for a minute as he read the rules. No. Actually, there's a section for minors. We'll need to have our parents sign a waiver just in case we get injured or something, so that'll be a challenge. But it's reasonable and they just say minor, not a specific age, so we can definitely apply. Hitoshi smiled. Okay, that sounds good. What do we need to do to apply? We need to send in basically a fake police file, Midoriya said. All the information the police would have on us if we were real villains. Hitoshi's face fell, like our quirks. Midoriya got a calculating look on his face. Not necessarily. Say we train enough that I can hack into the cameras and erase footage of us, and you can make people forget you ever brainwashed them, then we can argue that the police would reasonably remain ignorant of our quirks and and even our faces and identities, if we're careful enough. We can give them just enough information to give us the advantage, all while studying the sports festival to make sure we know what quirks and personalities we're up against. Do you really think they'll allow that? Hitoshi asked skeptically. Midoriya shrugged. No, but I'm not sure they'll allow us to be heroes either, and we're doing it anyway. Touché. Hitoshi rolled his eyes. We're gonna be heroes. Midoriya nodded. Villains first, but yeah, we're gonna be heroes. Hitoshi nervously straightened the paper again as he and Midoriya walked up to his foster home. It wasn't like the paper was that valuable. They just used the printer at the library to make a few copies of the permission waiver for the UA training exercise, so printing another wouldn't be a big deal or anything, but the paper felt valuable just because of what it represented. If they could both convince their parents, well, in Hitoshi's case, his guardians, to approve it, then they'd not only be able to practice all the strategies they were learning, but see how they matched up in a real fight against UA students. He wasn't sure how far they'd get, obviously, since the UA students would have way more training than the two of them, but Midoriya was right, it would be a good way to get their names out there and make themselves stand out from the tens of thousands of other kids who would be trying for the hero course next year. Assuming they could actually convince their guardians to sign off on it. He held open the door for Midoriya and waited for him to take off his shoes before leading him back into the kitchen. His foster parents should be home now, and even though they'd be tired from work, there probably wasn't any better time to have this conversation. That didn't mean that Hitoshi wasn't tempted to turn around and run in the other direction rather than risk getting in trouble though. His foster dad was sitting at the table reading a newspaper as his foster mom made dinner, but neither of them saw the two of them come in. Hitoshi scuffed the floor with his heel, making just enough non-vocal noise to get his foster dad to look up from his paper. Hitoshi's stomach sunk as he did a double take between Hitoshi and Midoriya before his face hardened into a clearly displeased expression. Hitoshi, you didn't tell us you'd be bringing a friend over. Oh, sorry. Midoriya had an innocently guilty expression on his face. I kinda insisted on coming over at the last minute and I was totally talking Shinso's ear off, so he didn't really have time to text you. Right? You're probably wondering that my name is Izuku Midoriya. You too must be Shinso's parents. Foster dad frowned, but looked a lot less angry than before, which made Hitoshi relax slightly. Having Midoriya take the blame for a last-minute visit seemed like it had been a good plan, even though the truth was that they'd planned it, but his foster parents didn't really like him talking to them at all, even though he'd already tried telling them that his quirk didn't work over texting. Midoriya, however, was just energetic enough that they'd both decided he might be able to pass it off as an accident. So you go to school with Hitoshi? Foster mom asked. No, we met after school one day. Midoriya replied brightly. The kids at my own school don't really like me. Hitoshi caught a gleam of satisfaction in Midoriya's eyes as his foster mom frowned in pity. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Midoriya shrugged but didn't respond. To have the greatest chance of success, they needed to fit themselves into the narrative that his foster parents already believed, namely, that Hitoshi was dangerous and that no one would willingly be friends with him. They would be more likely to believe Midoriya was hanging out with him because he lacked better options and it was safer than them thinking that Hitoshi was somehow manipulating, or worse brainwashing, him into being friends. Hence, the careful reluctance, which seemed to be working perfectly. So, Midoriya. Foster dad closed his newspaper. Are you here for dinner or? Oh. Midoriya grabbed the paper from Hitoshi like he just barely remembered it. Yes. I actually wanted to ask you guys something. I'm going to be going to this camp and I was wondering if Shinso could come along? It doesn't cost anything, but we do need parental permission. A camp? Foster dad hesitantly accepted the paper from Midoriya. What kind of camp? Well, I thought it's kind of a training camp. Midoriya grimaced. You see, I kinda want to be a hero, but honestly I don't really have a very good chance, so this is kinda to help me get a better idea of everything and see if it's even possible, you know? Foster dad hummed thoughtfully, but Hitoshi could tell he was still on the fence. And you want Hitoshi to come with you? You know he doesn't have a good shot at being a hero either, right? I think Hitoshi can be a great hero. Midoriya said firmly, eyes widening after a moment as he noticed his slip. But, I mostly just want him there so I don't have to be alone. It's an entire week and we sleep there, so he wouldn't be home for an entire week. I know that's probably a deal breaker, but no, that'll work. Foster Dad said quickly, pen flourishing across the paper. Just be careful, kid, okay? Hitoshi fought back a smile as Izuku grinned triumphantly. Don't worry, I will be. Kyoka blew a strand of hair out of her face, only for it to fall right back in front of her eyes. She would have just used her hand to brush it back, but both her hands were kind of busy at the moment lugging around a broken microwave. She'd never really been the strongest girl out there, so after less than a week of All Might's crazy clean the beach routine, her arms already felt like they were about to fall off. She was sure that the extra muscle would be useful and would really help her out in the hero course, but at the same time, this whole training program seemed just kinda illogical. It wasn't that she was complaining. Okay, well, maybe she kinda was, but anybody would be complaining if they were asked to clean an entire polluted beach by themselves. Like, she saw the appeal of building muscle, and All Might had insisted that without enough muscle mass his quirk would blow her arms off, but there were still some things that just weren't adding up. First of all, she wasn't even sure she wanted one for all. Sure, All Might and Recovery Girl had both said it was an amazing opportunity, and if she'd been allowed to tell her parents, she had no doubt that her dad would be pushing her to jump in with 2 feet, but for now, all she'd committed to doing was train to receive the quirk. So far, all that meant was a lot of muscle training, which, again, didn't make a whole lot of sense. One for all focused on strength, obviously. Anyone who had ever seen All Might fight could see that much, but at the same time, Kyoka just couldn't bring herself to believe that's all there was to it. Quirks just weren't that simple. Take her own quirk for example. Sure, it enhanced air hearing, but it also allowed her to project her heartbeat, not to mention the fact that it had a mutation element to it as well. It didn't fall into a neat little category because her quirk wasn't a one-trick pony, and she was pretty sure that was true for most quirks. One for all shouldn't be any different. She dumped the microwave in the truck they were using and stretched out her arms as she walked back to get another piece of garbage. All Might was a strong hero, but his go-to solution was usually to punch things, which meant that for him, the solution was always to have bigger muscles than his opponent and force his way to victory by sheer strength and force of will, but well, as much as Kyoka hated criticizing All Might, that didn't always work. When she was singing, muscling through a difficult passage could do more harm than good. Instead of trying to get stronger in that case, the best thing to do was improve the technique and airflow so that she got a good quality sound without hurting herself. It was the same with her instruments. A guitar could be made of the strongest wood on earth, but if the player didn't know how to use it, it would still sound terrible. There had to be some technique elements to using one for all that she should be preparing for in addition to just building muscle. Kyoka sighed and picked up a tire. Maybe she was just overcomplicating things. All Might seemed to be doing okay for himself and he only focused on muscle strength. Besides, who else was she supposed to ask? All Might had insisted that one for all was a huge secret that only a small handful knew about, so her best option was probably just to keep learning from the master and assume that All Might knew what he was doing. He was the expert after all, right? No, Tsukachi, I don't need either of their help. I've had one for all for decades now, I know what I'm doing. Kyoka paused as she heard All Might's voice filtering through the piles of trash. She wasn't quite sure where he was, but he was talking loud enough that her enhanced hearing could pick him up easily enough, even over the sound of the waves. Whoever he was talking to obviously knew about one for all, but All Might hadn't ever told her about anyone named Tsukachi before. I'm not saying you don't, but they might still be able to help. Tsukachi's voice was distorted in a way that meant that this was a phone call and Kyoka was tempted to walk away so she wouldn't overhear, but if All Might was going to be giving her his quirk, he didn't have any right to keep secrets about it. I mean, Nana got help from Gran Torino when she was training you, right? Nana only relied on Gran Torino to guide me because she knew what that monster would do to her, and to me if she left me without any guidance. All Might said coldly, I can handle this. I'm going to be teaching at UA as well, so I'm going to have to learn sometime. Also, Gran Torino is absolutely terrifying. Young Jiro still has a lot of work ahead of her and I don't want him traumatizing her. Well, what about Night Eye? Tsukachi asked. Have you even told him you found a successor? There was a long moment of silence before All Might answered, We haven't spoken to each other in years, Tsukachi. I doubt telling him now would go over very well. Kyoka shifted the tire so that it was on her shoulder and she could grab her phone with her other hand, sending herself a message with the names All Might and this Tsukashi dude had mentioned. Maybe there were other people she could ask for advice. It never hurt to get a new perspective, right? Unlike Hitoshi's foster parents, Izuku's mom actually read the whole permission slip before looking up at them worriedly. This says you might get hurt, baby. Are you sure you want to do this? It's the best way to figure out what being a hero really is. Izuku insisted, grateful for Hitoshi's presence at his side during this conversation. I know that it looks really cool on TV and that every little kid wants to be a hero, but I'm not a little kid anymore. I know this exercise might be dangerous, but it's way more controlled than typical hero work. They have Recovery Girl, who's the best healing hero working right now, and all sorts of other precautions to keep people from getting hurt in the first place. It'll give me a good sense for what the hero industry actually is, and I'd really rather know now if it's really too dangerous for me rather than figure that out in the middle of an actual hero fight where I could get seriously injured. Oh, Mom bit her lip and looked down at the paper again. So you think this exercise will help you decide whether you can really handle being a hero? Even though he knew it was coming, Izuku's stomach still sank. He'd been the one to come up with the strategy of fitting their request for permission into their parents' existing prejudices, but it still stung that the only way to get his mom to say yes to was to let her believe that this was the final push he needed to give up on his dream. He swallowed his nausea and forced himself to smile. Yeah, that's basically the point of the exercise. Mom nodded and turned to Hitoshi, and you're going with him? Hitoshi nodded. It's safer to have someone there so we can watch each other's backs. Mom was tense for a moment, but after it became clear that Hitoshi wasn't going to ask her a question, she relaxed and picked up the pen. Okay, but I need you to promise to be careful, okay baby? Don't take any unnecessary risks, and if there's someone you don't think you can beat, just run, okay? Izuku nodded and he glanced over at Hitoshi, who looked just as happy and relieved as he felt. Don't worry. We'll make sure we can win. Kyoka double-checked her phone again and sure enough, this seemingly abandoned apartment building was exactly where her Maps app was leading her. She huffed in frustrated disappointment. It had been hard enough to find anything on some old hero named Gran Torino, and it had been even harder to find a current address. The internet had been pretty much a total bust, and she'd ended up just calling Recovery Girl and asking if she knew anything. That, of course, had led to an awkward conversation about how no, All Might hadn't told her and yes, she was planning on reaching out anyway, but thankfully instead of being angry at her for eavesdropping, Recovery Girl had just laughed and promised not to give away the surprise. It wasn't supposed to be a surprise, not really. Kyoka just needed some advice beyond get stronger and punch things and was hoping this Gran Torino dude would be able to help. Well, the address Recovery Girl had given her was obviously wrong. There was no way that anyone could actually live here, but it left a sour taste in her mouth to just turn around and leave after she'd come all this way. She sighed and trudged up the steps. She'd knock and wait a few minutes, but when nobody answered she was just going home. Her knocks echoed through the house, but after a moment, Kyoka heard shuffling from inside. There was actually someone in there. She stuck her hand in her pocket and wrapped it around her pepper spray just to be safe, even though she really shouldn't be as trigger-happy as she was last time, but just in case it wasn't Gran Torino who opened the door. Maybe she should have asked All Might to come with her and introduce them. The door opened and she had to look down to see the owner of the house because he was so old that he'd shrunk just like Recovery Girl had. He wasn't a lot to look at, just a standard old man with a stubbly beard and a big flannel shirt who probably ate too many TV dinners, but he glared up at her while holding his cane in a way that made it very clear that she was one wrong move away from losing her kneecaps. Who are you? Are you selling cookies? Kyoka blinked. What? No. Shame. The man let out a disgruntled noise. So why are you here then? Well, I'd like to ask you a few questions actually. Kyoka said. Assuming you're actually the guy I'm looking for. Oh yeah. He gave her an appraising look. And who is that? Gran Torino. Kyoka smiled when his eyes widened. That's you, right? Recovery girl told me I was looking for a crotchety old man. Gran Torino guffawed loudly. Oh, is that what she told you? Well, it takes one to know one, that's for sure. And why would you be looking for a crotchety old man like me? I was hoping you'd be able to offer some more insight about a secret All Might told me. Kyoka said cryptically. What do you know about One for All? Izuku and Hitoshi let the psychological thriller they were watching play in the background as they watched clips of last year's sports festival on Izuku's laptop. They each had notebooks open right next to them with the name of the student they were currently analyzing, which at the moment was a second year named Tamaki Amajiki. His quirk is so interesting. Izuku gushed. Depending on the combination, he could probably imitate almost any quirk. Does it work on inorganic materials? Like, if he ate a piece of a balloon, could he float? Actually, that wouldn't really work, but maybe if he inhaled helium. I think it's safe to assume that most of what he manifests is actually food. Hitoshi pointed out. It's weird finding somebody so shy in the hero course though. He'll most likely try to stick to a supporting role, but if we can force him into the spotlight, his anxiety is bound to give us the advantage, especially if we can isolate him from those two other kids he always sits with at the end of his fights. They're his support system, so remove them. Izuku grinned, and he just might crumble. Controlling what he eats is a little harder, especially since we obviously don't want to just starve him or anything, and will only become relevant if it ends up being beneficial to capture him, but that I can do some research into some plants or things that won't give him any useful traits. Maybe corn? It doesn't have vines, so it'll be harder to weaponize. Getting hit with corn cobs is still gonna hurt. Hitoshi pointed out. But yeah, not really as scary as a blackberry bush wrapping around you or, like, a bull's horns or something. Yeah. Izuku wrote himself a note for later. I think I've got an okay idea of his quirk now. What about you? Do you have a clear picture of his personality? Hitoshi raised an eyebrow. I've been picking apart people's brains since I was 4, Izuku. You have to know what makes a person tick to make them talk. Izuku grinned and flipped to the next page. Okay then, who's next? How about Mirio Togata? Hitoshi shrugged. Sounds good to me. Gran Torino grabbed Kyoka by the arm and dragged her inside, slamming the door behind her. What did you just say? He was a lot faster than she was expecting and a lot stronger too. Kyoka winced and rubbed at her arm as soon as he let her go. I said, I wanted to know more about One for All. Gran Torino just glared at her suspiciously. And how do you even know about it? All Might told me. Kyoka steadily returned his glare. He said he wants me to inherit it, but at the same time, I know there's something he's not telling me. If I'm going to let somebody else give me a quirk, I'd like to know what I'm getting into. Gran Torino frowned and pulled out his phone, but he was no longer staring daggers at her, so that was an improvement. He still gave her a suspicious glance as he held the phone up to his ear, though. Kyoka's eyes widened when All Might answered the phone. Gran Torino? What do I owe the pleasure? I wasn't expecting a call from you today. I have a girl here who says she's your successor. Gran Torino said. Purple hair, more attitude than Nana had at your age, sound familiar? If she's your successor, why the hell aren't you here with her? Jiro heard a hacking cough on the other end of the phone and grimaced as she realized All Might was spitting up blood again. That was her bad. I didn't actually tell him I was coming. I overheard him talking about you with some guy named Tsukachi and just thought you might be able to help me. Gran Torino blinked at her for a moment as All Might spluttered excuses before he took a deep breath and yelled into the phone. That's even worse, you nincompoop. Were you really so sparse on the details that this girl had to go out of her way to find somebody to give her some answers? You know what? She seems like a nice girl and I'm glad you found somebody with a lick of sense at least, so I'll help you out and answer her questions, okay? But you owe me a full box of taiyaki, got it? Why yes sir. All Might spluttered. Of course. Thank you. Gran Torino hung up the phone as Jiro looked at him in shock. Alright kid, now what's your name? Kyoka Jiro. Kyoka said. Sir? Gran Torino just rolled his eyes. Just call me Gran. All Might only bothers with that stuff because I had to beat some sense into him when he was younger. Now what all did that all-American peacock tell you about One for All? Well, he told me that it's a quirk that gets passed down and that it'll make me stronger. Jiro started. But it's not really the quirk itself that I have questions about. My problem is more, like, about the training? All Might told me that if I don't have enough muscle mass when I accept it, it'll blow my arms off, which we obviously don't want to have happen, right? But, like, I get that it's a lot of power, but muscle mass can't be the only way to HRNSS it. Muscle takes a lot of time to build, and showing up to the entrance exam with a new quirk that I've never used before just sounds like a recipe for disaster to me. Gran stared at her with an unreadable expression for a long moment before pulling out his phone again. You told her she couldn't receive it until when? I just wish Katsuki would leave me alone. Izuku groaned as Hitoshi helped him bandage yet another burn. It's like the more I work on stealth, the more he thinks I'm just ignoring him or looking down on him. I can avoid him for a while, but that just makes it worse when he finally catches you. Hitoshi nodded. Yeah, my bullies are the same way. I wonder. Izuku looked up. Do you have a way to stop it? Hitoshi shrugged. Maybe. Remember when we first met and all my bullies thought you were some kind of villain backup coming to help me? Izuku nodded. It made them run away. And they stopped bothering me at school for a few weeks. Hitoshi added. So, what would happen if we do that again, but, like, intentionally this time? I tell my bullies you're scarier than I am and you tell yours that I'm scarier than you are, so they leave us both alone so the other one doesn't get angry or whatever. Think that would work? Maybe not on Kaken, but it's still worth it to get rid of everyone else. Izuku muttered thoughtfully. If we can start the right rumors. Hitoshi smiled. Then maybe we can finally get some peace. Toshinori had had nightmares like this. Him, sitting in the principal's office like a scolded child while Gran Torino had tea with Nedzu. He shivered. At least they weren't training. I agree with you that waiting until the entrance exam is risky. Nedzu said. But receiving One for All too early also has its own risks. Well, yeah. Gran Torino shrugged. It's a centuries-old quirk with way too much power for a single person. That's a no-brainer. Toshinori cleared his throat. I was having her wait until she was going to enter UA not only to give her time to gain enough muscle, but also because she'd be able to freely access UA's resources, for example Recovery Girl, if she did get injured. Gran Torino gave him a withering look. You can just call her you know. Well, yes. Toshinori blushed. But it would take time to get to her, and in the case of a critical injury. It would be safest for the majority of quirk training to happen on UA grounds, where Recovery Girl services would be immediately available. Nedzu nodded. If that is the major concern, then I believe that I might have a solution. We have a training exercise coming up where we will be pitting our students against civilians acting as villains. This gives them an opportunity to test their abilities against a wide variety of skill sets and allows them to see what fighting actual villains will be like on a daily basis, since most of the individuals they fight will not be S-class threats. We have a third party coming in as the civilians. However, if your successor were to participate as a villain, it would give her the chance to get to know One for All in an environment where medical services are readily available, as well as Eraserhead, just in case we need to cancel the quirk in the case of an emergency. How does that sound? It sounds perfect. Gran Torino exclaimed. Why didn't you lead with that? Toshinori sighed. I still think it would be better to wait, but if you both think it's a good idea then, well, I suppose that it's the best course of action. I just want her to have the best chance at success as we can give her. Perfect. Nedzu said. Then I'll draft the necessary paperwork for you to give to her. This is going to be so exciting. Izuku glanced over to make sure Katsuki was watching as he waved goodbye to Hitoshi. See you later. Yeah, sure. Hitoshi lowered his voice. You sure you want to do this? Yes. Izuku said firmly. He needs to know you're dangerous. Hitoshi nodded and took control as he walked away. Izuku's brain fogged over and he lost control of his body, but he could still remember the plan. Seeing him like this would make Katsuki angry because he'd automatically assumed that Izuku was ignoring him, not that he was brainwashed. He'd hit Izuku, like he always did, which would break the brainwashing, and from there it was just making sure he came to the right conclusions. Simple. Oi, Deku, who the hell was that? Katsuki came storming up to him, just like Izuku knew he would, his lackeys trailing a few feet behind. Well, who was that purple-eye bag idiot, huh? Izuku didn't respond. Are you ignoring me? Katsuki looked like he was about to burst a blood vessel. I'm right here, you demon nerd, answer me. Who was that? Again, Izuku said nothing, obviously because he couldn't, and Katsuki did exactly what he wanted him to. He punched him right in the... Stop ignoring me! Katsuki yelled. You idiot! When I ask a question you answer. Got it? Izuku sniffled. Thank you, Kaken. Katsuki stopped. What? Well, Shinso forgot to deactivate his quirk when he left, so I couldn't actually respond to anything. Izuku rambled. He's got this super awesome brainwashing quirk and it's really cool. Katsuki's lackeys looked absolutely horrified and Izuku fought to keep a smile off his face. It wouldn't be long before the entire school knew about the quirkless kid's villain friend who would brainwash them into SBM Zen if they made one wrong move. Now, it was just making sure Katsuki believed that Izuku wasn't ignoring him intentionally. But, well, Izuku continued, it's just that sometimes we're experimenting with his quirk and he just forgets to deactivate it, and so if it looks like I'm ignoring you, I'm really not. I just might not be able to respond. I'm sorry, Kaken, I really am. There was a long moment before Katsuki scoffed. Of course you'd be too weak to save yourself from some extra's quirk, Deku. Of course only a brainwasher would hang out with a useless Deku like you. He stalked away, his lackeys following with one last glance over their shoulders, and Izuku melted in relief. You can come out now, they're gone. Hitoshi rounded the corner, glaring in the direction Katsuki had walked. Are you sure you don't want me to brainwash him into doing something embarrassing? Izuku shook his head. The important thing is that he leaves me alone, and now that we've thrown some doubt onto his theory that I'm intentionally ignoring him, it'll be a while before he finds something else to be mad at. Thank you so much, Hitoshi. Hitoshi shrugged. It's whatever. Do you have the notebook I asked for? Izuku nodded and dug around in his backpack before handing it to him. This will be enough, right? Hitoshi smirked as he flipped through the pages. Oh, this will be more than enough. This is gonna be great. Hitoshi usually didn't intentionally go where his bullies hung out, but today was an exception. He had the notebook bent and stuffed into his pocket, ready to fall out the minute things got physical. Now to get his bullies to take the bait. Hey villain, get outta here. Hitoshi bit back a smile as his bullies saw him. He just continued on like he didn't hear him, but he was walking slowly enough it didn't take much time for them to catch up. What are you doing here, brainwasher? The ringleader spat. Are you looking for a beating? Hitoshi just looked at the floor and kept walking until the ringleader shoved him, making him stumble just hard enough to knock Izuku's notebook to the floor. Bingo. He was shoved against the wall as the ringleader kept shouting some nonsense or other at him, but that wasn't the guy he was most interested in. No, that was the one who had just picked up the notebook and was flipping through it, mild terror growing more intense with every page. Guys, I think you need to see this. The ringleader let go of Hitoshi as the whole group huddled around the notebook. What the F dash? Is this about us? Did you make this, you demon villain? No, Hitoshi answered honestly. My friend Midoriya did. I didn't tell him that much about you, but he managed to find out where I lived after only meeting me once, so I'm sure there's more in there. I haven't read it yet, sorry. The ringleader's eyes widened and he shoved the notebook at one of the other bullies. You've got a fire quirk. Burn it. He turned to Hitoshi. You keep that freak away from us, you hear? I'm sorry, Hitoshi said with false sincerity, but I can't control him. The ringleader went pale. But you're a brainwasher. You can't. Hitoshi shrugged. I don't want to get on his bad side, and I'm sure you don't either. Well, see you at school. He walked away as the bullies trembled behind him and couldn't hold back a small smile. School was going to be a lot more enjoyable after this. Kyoka had never been one to chase hero fights. She'd watch them if she saw one on her way home from school, but she'd had far too many nightmares about hearing someone call out for help from under the rubble and the hero fighting couldn't hear them. She always woke up feeling helpless, which was part of the reason she wanted to be a hero in the first place. She hated the idea of hearing someone call out for help and not being able to do anything about it. So no, she didn't make a habit of watching hero fights, but she also didn't make a habit out of leaping in headfirst before she looked, so she'd been trying to watch as many of All Might's fights as she could ever since he had offered her one for all. She knew that she could always catch the recordings on the news later, but it was just different in person. She couldn't really listen to a recording, not in the same way. The poor quality mics that the news stations used would never have been able to pick up the subtle of energy surrounding All Might as he resolved a hostage situation. Kyoka closed her eyes and focused on the steady buzz of energy, straining her ears to sort it out from the sounds of the crowd and the fight. One for all sounded almost electric, but the part that had surprised her the most wasn't that it had sound, it was the fact that it was almost harmonic. It made sense, since each holder in the past had contributed their energy to the quirk, but the subtle way that they interweaved was weirdly haunting. She just wished she could actually listen. Whenever All Might was fighting, it was too loud to really enjoy the depth of the sound. She could still hear One for All when All Might was in his smaller form, now that she knew what to look for, but it was quieter and almost non-existent, so she couldn't really hear it. She was curious about how it would sound when she actually got the quirk. Hopefully she'd at least have a bit more time to listen then. The crowd surged and someone was pushed into her from behind. Whoever it was ended up dropping a notebook in front of her and she extended her earphone jacks to catch it before it hit the ground. She grabbed the notebook and looked around. Who? Mine's sorry. A boy around her age brushed his green hair out of his face and grimaced. Sorry, I was trying to get closer and... He trailed off as his eyes caught on something in the fight, and before she could say anything else, he had snatched his notebook from her hands and was already shouldering his way through to the front. Kyoka looked through the crowd after him, her eyes widening when she realized that All Might was starting to steam and the hum of One for All was taking on a strained quality. He needed to get out of there. Thankfully, another hero leapt into action and Kyoka breathed a sigh of relief as All Might was able to slip away. She frowned as she thought of the boy. Had he realized the fight was almost over? She sighed and shrugged it off. It was weird, but probably not that important in the grand scheme of things. The crowd was starting to clear out and Kyoka ducked inside the mall to get away from all the people and the noise. She wasn't in any rush and All Might obviously wouldn't be up for any training right now, so maybe she could just window shop and kill time while she waited for the crowds from the fight to go away. Kyoka started walking toward one of her favorite stores that sold the kind of alternative-style clothing that she liked to wear. She could use a new pair of pants anyway. Hitoshi, Izuku said hopelessly. I think we're lost. Hitoshi raised an eyebrow, physically or metaphorically? Because I think both apply. Izuku swallowed. I know darkwear sounded like a good idea when we saw it on the map, but I have no idea where to even start. Pants. A voice said behind them. Or maybe skirts if that's more your style. Shinso whirled around to see a girl their age with what looked like headphone jacks hanging from her ears looking at them in amusement. No, we're trying to prioritize freedom of movement. So pants will be fine. Izuku's eyes widened. You're that girl I saw earlier. You were watching All Might's fight. And you're the one that ran into me. She shrugged and her earphones mimicked the movement. Izuku immediately started mumbling. Those aren't just hanging from her ears, they are her ears, which means it's part of her quirk. That's so cool. It must come with advanced hearing and... Hitoshi dug an elbow into his ribs before he could start muttering full force. Izuku, we're not trying to scare this one off. Izuku blushed. Sorry? The girl shrugged again. Whatever. You were right about the enhanced hearing, so I'm used to tuning things out. I'm sorry. Izuku mumbled, blushing deeper. That must get really annoying. Again, I'm used to it. The girl said. My name is Jiro, by the way. I am Shinso. Hitoshi said. And this chatterbox is Midoriya. Jiro nodded. So what led to this complete overhaul in style? Did your girlfriends break up with you or something? Hitoshi didn't know why he ended up blushing at that, but hopefully it wasn't too noticeable. No, it's kind of hard to explain. Hey, I'm not here to judge. Jiro rolled her eyes. I'm also not here to help, but you two were wandering around like lost little puppies and it was kinda obvious that you were desperate. Thanks. Hitoshi said dryly. Jiro smiled for the first time since they'd met her. No problem. I'm gonna be a hero, so helping those who can't help themselves is kinda in the job description. Hitoshi gave her a tired glare as Izuku latched onto what she just said. You're going to be a hero? So that's really kind of why we're here. We're trying to get some combat experience, so we're doing this thing where we're pretending to be, like, fake villains, kind of? To help hero students in training. Jiro shook her head. You do realize how fake that sounds, right? If I wasn't participating in the exact same exercise, I'd be tempted to think you two were looking for vigilante gear. Wait, you're doing the same exercise? Hitoshi gave her a skeptical look. At UA? No, at Shiketsu. Jiro scoffed. Of course at UA. No other school would be crazy enough to put on an exercise like that. True. Hitoshi hummed. So are you looking for an outfit for the exercise too? No, I was just planning on throwing together some junk from my closets. Jiro shrugged. I dress like this every day. So what you're saying is that you're the perfect person to help us. Izuku grinned. You're already familiar with the exercise and you said it yourself, this is your aesthetic. So don't we start with pants, right? We want something with a lot of pockets, if we can. That I think I saw a couple pairs over here. Jiro started leading them to another section of the store. You'll want to stick with blacks and grays, obviously, since I'm guessing you're wanting to blend in with the cityscape. Exactly. Hitoshi said. But we also want to be memorable if we are seen. So maybe a pop of color. Jiro said thoughtfully. And you'll want to look stronger than you are, which means a looser cut around your arms and legs to hide those noodles you two have going on. Hey! Hitoshi cried indignantly. We've been working out. Jiro shot him an amused look. Obviously not enough. I mean, she is kind of right. Izuku grimaced. We are mostly planning to rely on strategy and intelligence rather than brute strength. Well, at least you've got a brain. Jiro shrugged. That's more than some heroes I can mention. These pants look like they'll be alright. Things were a lot less confusing with Jiro helping them, and Hitoshi found himself enjoying her snarky commentary as she helped them sort through the different options. A lot of items, like armored shirts and sturdy boots, they realized they were going to have to buy somewhere else, like an army surplus store, but they at least got a good start on their villain look. The worst part though was buying the jackets. This is not a jacket. Hitoshi deadpanned, holding up the offensive article of clothing. This is a crop top. Yeah, but it's what's in style. Jiro snickered. What? You don't want to show the world your non-existent abs. Haha, very funny. Hitoshi rolled his eyes. It just doesn't seem very practical. We'll be wearing armored shirts underneath. Izuku argued. And the shorter cut will allow for more freedom of movement. Plus the longer version is 3 times more expensive, so we're getting crop top jackets. Hitoshi sighed. But I'm getting the one with the purple trim. Izuku, you get the one with green. It's nap time. You're ridiculous, Jiro said. But good luck with the exercise. Not sure if we're competing against each other or just with the hero students, but either way, good luck. Maybe we'll get pitted against the same group of students. Hayashi found himself smiling. Yeah, that'd be fun. You can recognize us by our crop tops. Oh, you'll look great. Jiro smiled. I'd better be going. See you later. Hitoshi waved to her as Izuku gathered everything to take up to the register. Bye. Nedza grinned as his employees started scanning through the list of names they needed to clear and approve files for before the exercise began. It was mostly a formality, since all of these applicants had already had to pass a basic background check to get this far, and the vast majority had either participated in the exercise in previous years or had come recommended by a pro hero, with a few notable exceptions. Nedzu was curious what his staff would think of their volunteers this year. They had a good mix of skill levels, not to mention the fact that All Might's new successor would be participating, so no matter what, it was bound to be an interesting exercise. Most of these are repeats, so they already know what's up. Snipe said after a long pause. Major thing is just to make sure they don't get pitted against the same students. We'll also have to skim over their files to make sure they're not trying to slip anything through. Aizawa pointed out. But yes, they already know the rules, so their files won't need as much work. There's some fresh blood here too. Midnight hummed. We've got a few younger applicants, actually. There's even a few middle schoolers. Cute little babies. A few. All Might blinked in surprise. I thought there was only one. There's actually 4. Nedza gave an excited little chirp. How about we start with them, since you find them so interesting? That sounds wonderful. Recovery Girl said. Who's first? This Kaminari kid. Cementos pointed to the name. That's Electra's kid, right? Yes. Nedza said. And if you'll look, you'll see that she is participating as well. I think I remember hearing that she takes each of her kids on a special trip every year, just to help with work-life balance, what with her being a pro hero who takes a lot of overseas missions. 13 said. It's sweet. If this is a family bonding activity, then the kid must be trying to be a hero. Aizawa said. He's the right age to be applying to UA. That he is. Nedzu nodded. He was always so proud of his teachers when they caught onto something small like that, even if it was painfully obvious once one had all the necessary information. It was entertaining watching them grow. And he and his mother seemed to be planning on working in a team, so I'll let you take a look at both files. He started passing around copies of the files the Kaminaris had sent in. They were very convincing files, obviously, since Electra had seen more police files than the average person, and had all the information on their quirks and fighting style that one would see in the files that was usually given to heroes at the start of a mission, exactly as they wanted it. Aizawa gave the files a once-over for less than a minute before shutting them and pushing them away. Electra knows what she's doing. Let's stop wasting time and move on to the next one. That'd be Kyoka Jiro, isn't that right? Recovery Girl piped up. Gran Torino suggested she do the exercise. I haven't heard from that old geezer in forever. Snipe laughed. How's he doing? Maybe I'd know if he called more often. Recovery Girl griped. That old man likes to pretend he has dementia, but from how often he forgets that other people exist, you'd think he actually did. Well, let's hope he didn't forget to help her with her file. Aizawa said, reaching out for Jiro's file. She's got a pretty rockin' mugshot. Present Mike said. And a quirk that enhances her hearing will make for an interesting challenge for our kiddos, that's for sure. Nedzu watched All Might squirm in his seat as his new co-workers essentially passed judgment on his successor without him being able to acknowledge her as such. If he insisted on keeping one for all a secret, then he would have to get used to situations like this, and ones that were even more odd and uncomfortable once she started showing signs of her new quirk. Nedza didn't know why he hadn't thought of having All Might's successor participate in this exercise earlier. It would be a nice test run to see how the quirk affected her, and by the time school started, he'd be prepared with a nice cup of tea and a list of suggestions for improvement. It was perfect. Well, we'll have to have her make a few minor changes. 13 said. But it mostly looks good. You said we have 2 other kiddos their age, right? Yes. Izuku Midwariya and Hitoshi Shinso. Niza grinned and pulled out the file, passing copies around the table. The file was suspiciously thin, something that did not go unnoticed by his staff. Mike accepted the file with a confused look. Is this it? Which of the 2 is this one for? Both. Nedza said. They always work as a team, so one file is sufficient. I wouldn't describe this as sufficient. Aizawa said dryly. There isn't even a mugshot. Midnight said. How are they supposed to be villains without mugshots? There is a photo, Snipe pointed out hesitantly. It looks like security footage, but still. There's none of their actual faces though. Cementos said. They're wearing masks in that one. That is because they have never been arrested. Nedza said. Or so they claim. What little they did put in the file says that they specialize in stealth and that one of the 2 has experience with hacking, so they are rarely, if ever, caught on camera, and never out of costume. It's a bold claim. Ectoplasm said. It might put our students at a disadvantage. But they're going to get cases with hardly any info once they graduate. Aizawa groaned. We're going to let them keep their mystery file, aren't we? As you would say, it's only logical. Nedzu chirped happily. Although if the rest of you do not agree, we can insist they add more information to it. They had to identify themselves and their quirks to submit, right? Mike asked. What powers do they have? Hitoshi Shinso has a brainwashing quirk. Nedzu said, which is part of the evidence the two cited for how they had never been arrested. Izuku Midoriya is quirkless. The room went quiet. After a long moment, Midnight spoke up. I say let it stand. Yes. 13 nodded. I hate to say it, but those kids are going to need every advantage we can give them. Plus, it's not as if they'll be able to keep themselves hidden for long. Ectoplasm said, our students are smart, they'll figure out Shinso's quirk the first time he uses it. Yeah. Snipe agreed. It's just like Aizawa said, it'll be good for them to practice filling out sparse villain files, but their advantage won't last more than a day or two, assuming they stay in the exercise that long. Which isn't very likely. Aizawa sighed. They might surprise us, but I'm not counting on it. Whatever, the point is to have a wide variety of skill levels. The students need some easy takedowns if they're going to be fighting the likes of Elektra as well. So we'll put them fighting the same group. Cementos said. May as well throw in the other middle schooler too. Maybe they'll be able to make some friends. We should pit them against the second years, just for a good balance. Midnight added. The third years would crush those kids in a heartbeat and the first years don't do the exercise. Then it's decided. Nedzu clapped his paws together. Those four will all face off against our second-year students in the exercise. Yes, this year was going to be interesting indeed. It seemed weird that a huge defining moment of her life would take place in a school nurse's office, but Kyoka had to get one for all somewhere and she guessed that Recovery Girl's office was better than a half-clean training beach. It was ridiculously early, but the exercise started at noon and the villains were supposed to arrive around sunrise so that they had time to go over the rules one final time and enter the test city a few hours before the hero students did. The company providing the civilians for the exercise had apparently arrived yesterday and had been setting things up in the city since last night. Kyoka was already wearing her villain outfit and had everything she was allowed to bring to the exercise, mostly stuff like flashlights and her pepper spray that had somehow gotten approved, so all that was left was to get her quirk and she'd be ready. She wasn't quite sure when her thoughts had shifted from if to when she got one for all, but it must have happened at some point because here she was, ready to make a decision that would impact the rest of her life. Dad would be so proud. The door opened and All Might walked in, flanked on either side by Recovery Girl and Gran Torino. If it hadn't worked out so well, Kyoka would have been tempted cringe at the audacity of seeking out her mentor's mentor to train her just because she didn't like the way All Might suggested, but at the end of the day, Gran's vision of what training for one for all should look like meshed a lot better with her fighting style than All Might's point and hit strategy. The last few weeks had been spent cleaning the beach like they had originally planned, but also meditating, studying, and listening to One for All as often as she could so that she was ready for today. This is a great responsibility, young Jiro. All Might said solemnly. A sacred torch that has been passed down for generations. Recovery Girl hit All Might in the knees with her cane. Don't scare her off before she's even gotten the quirk, you nitwit. It is a sacred responsibility. Gran Troino acknowledged. But at the end of the day, I've known the holders of this quirk for decades and it has been passed through some of the greatest heroes I know. Try to welcome it like an old friend, if you can. Kyoka swallowed dryly and nodded. Okay, I'm ready. All Might smiled and plucked a hair from his head. Eat this. Izuku swallowed as he stared up at the massive gates of Ua. We're finally here. Yeah. Hitoshi breathed. And soon we're gonna be back as students. They were both dressed in the villain outfits they'd bought and Izuku was floored by how well everything had come together. They'd found armored shirts that were meant for people with destructive quirks so they had at least some measure of protection, but they'd also found a lot of other things, like climbing harnesses that would allow them to rappel down buildings or hide up off the ground in a pinch. For two bullied kids, Hitoshi thought they looked pretty cool. Izuku nodded in awe. I know we've been preparing for this for weeks now, but still, it doesn't feel real. Hitoshi chuckled. Yeah, I get it. But we've got all your plans and we're ready for this, aren't we? Izuku's depression hardened in determination. Right. We're ready. Let's do this. The entire school was basically a maze, and if the two of them hadn't spent the last week studying every last resource they could find on both UA and the Heroes vs. Villains exercise, Hitoshi wasn't sure they would have been able to find the auditorium at all. As it was, they just barely avoided taking a few wrong turns and arrived at the auditorium to find it almost empty with the exception of a few other fake villains wandering around in small groups and picking their seats. A few looked over at them as they came in, and Hitoshi made a note of who kept them in the corner of their eye after looking away. They'd have to watch out for those ones. Hitoshi didn't pay them too much mind, however, considering that his eyes were immediately drawn to the girl sitting by herself about halfway toward the back of the room. Izuku smiled as he recognized her too. Jiro, you made it. She jumped at Izuku's shout, her earphones twitching slightly before she relaxed and gave them a cocky grin. Hey, what a nice surprise. I thought you two would have gotten lost before you made it to the front gate. Hitoshi rolled his eyes. Very funny. What about you? This place is like a maze. How did you find this room? You must have been a part of the exercise before, right? Izuku asked. That's how you knew where to go. Nah, nothing that fancy. Jiro shook her head. I was hanging out with my mentor before this and he walked me down. Izuku's eyes widened hungrily. Mentor? Who? Your outfits look good. Jiro interrupted. I guess you ended up finding all the pieces you needed to finish them. Oh, yeah. And more, honestly. Hitoshi glanced down at his outfit. Is that your villain outfit? Or is it just what you pulled out of your closet this morning? Meh, Jiro shrugged. It's a little bit of both, not gonna lie. She was wearing baggy cargo pants, just like he and Izuku were, but she'd paired hers with combat boots that laced all the way up above her knees and a variety of belts hanging around her waist. Up top she'd paired a dark gray tank top with a black half shirt that was basically just sleeves with a high neckline to keep it in place. In short, she looked like a badass and Hitoshi had to turn away so he wouldn't stare too long. Well, it looks alright for something you just threw together last minute. We should probably go sit down, Izuku said, pointing to the crowds of people wandering in, small groups being led by various pro-heroes who must have found them wandering around the halls of UA. It looks like they're starting to round up the stragglers. Jiro gave them a questioning look and Hitoshi rushed to explain. Izuku wanted to sit in the back so we could watch everyone come in. The people who got here before us either did the exercise in previous years or did a lot of research just like we did. They're wild cards. Izuku added. They're probably not as useful as allies as the people who showed up without getting lost, but they could also cause problems we're not expecting because they're less prepared. I want to see what we're working with, while simultaneously hiding your own strength and weaknesses behind those masks of yours. Jiro nodded. Smart, but unnecessary. We're fighting the heroes, not these guys. Izuku shook his head. That's what they want you to think, but really, they've written the rules to make this just as much of a competition between the villains as it is a fight between the villains as it is a fight against the heroes. It enhances the realism of the scenario. In real life, there's just as much infighting as there is conflict between heroes and villains. Maybe even more. Hitoshi explained. So yeah, once we get in there, it's kinda every man for himself. Jiro smirked. So what I'm hearing is that there's no hard feelings if I stab you two in the back? Of course not. Hitoshi smiled. Because we'll be the ones stabbing you in the back first. Jiro gave him a look. Go, do your creepy retcon or whatever. I'll see you in the arena. Hitoshi lowered his voice and leaned in closer. Not if we're doing our jobs right. Hitoshi, we gotta go. Izuku's eyes darted around and Hitoshi realized he'd already taken out his notebook and his hands were twitching like he was already trying to write all the thoughts and observations running through his head. Oh yeah, catch you later, Jiro, good luck. Jiro nodded. Right back at ya. The two of them silently made either way toward the back of the auditorium, melting into the shadows as much as they could. Those of the new people who did see them either stared or immediately looked away, which meant that their plan to be intimidating, or at the very least mysterious, was working well. As soon as they sat down, Izuku's pen immediately started flying across the pages of his notebook and Hitoshi got his out more slowly, but he was still mentally filing away how the other fake villains interacted with each other and what personality traits they could exploit later, if they really needed to. The villains were definitely at a disadvantage in this exercise, but Izuku and he had lived their entire lives at a disadvantage, so really, they were right in their comfort zone. And they were about to show everyone what they could do. Denki eyed the two guys in combat gear and swallowed. Yeah, he was definitely going to be steering clear of those guys. Mom grinned as she elbowed him in the ribs. What do you think, Sparky? Isn't this gonna be fun? Denki gave a bright smile. Yeah, it's gonna be great. His smile fell the moment that Mom looked away. It wasn't that he wasn't excited. It was going to be a lot of fun, but he was also kinda starting to freak out. Mom knew he wanted to be a hero, but she wasn't around a lot, so it had been a while since she'd actually seen him fight. He had to be good at combat though, because that would be his only saving grace if he somehow bombed the academic portion of the UA entrance exam. That there were other schools that might take him, obviously, but Mom had been so proud when he'd said that he was shooting for UA and he didn't want to disappoint her. Or himself, honestly. He'd be pretty bummed if he didn't make it in. Present Mike walked up onto the stage and Denki couldn't help grinning. He'd been the one and found him and Mom when they'd gotten lost on the way to the auditorium. It had been long enough since she'd gone here that either they'd remodeled or she'd just forgotten her way around. Either was a possibility, but Denki had been terrified that they were going to be late when Present Mike had finally found them wandering around the third floor and lead them and a whole lunch of others here just in time. He'd laughed and joked with them and the others they'd found for the entire time, so yeah, Denki was pretty sure he'd just discovered a new favorite hero. Hello there, listeners. Mike yelled. Welcome to our annual Heroes vs. Villains exercise at UA High School. Even though all of you are good people and some of you are even pro-heroes IRL, this week, you get to embrace your dark side and become heroes to our students by playing the villains. There was an awkward pause and Denki was fairly certain they were supposed to cheer, but it was too late now, so Denki just cheered emotionally and hoped it counted for something somehow. Love the enthusiasm. Mike grumbled. Alright, let's get back to it. The villains in this exercise, that's you, are trying to achieve objectives. You should have gotten a list of these bad boys in the big stack of paperwork we gave you when your applications were approved. They're gonna be things like steal this painting, kidnap this victim, typically crimes that our students are gonna come across in the field. For each objective that you manage to hold onto for the whole week and escape with at the end, you'll get some cold hard cash, so try to go home with as many as possible. Just to keep things interesting, you have to actually leave the city on the last day, though. No just stashing your objectives somewhere and raking in the cash, that doesn't count. Denki wasn't here for the money, but he wouldn't deny it would be nice to have a little extra cash. Mom made a good amount, obviously, but it was always different spending money that he'd earned himself and he wanted to help pay for UA somehow. Assuming he actually got in. That meant, though, that they were up against a lot of guys who were only in it for the money and would do what was necessary to get it. So that would be interesting. The hero's goal is to stop you. Present Mike continued. But that doesn't mean that they don't have other objectives too. They've got a list just like yours of things they can do for extra credit points, but this is things like finding lost children or doing a press interview. Typical hero stuff. Now onto the fun part. Your weapons you weren't allowed to bring any in with you, except for your quirk obviously, but there will be some available inside the arena itself. It might require a little bit of work to get them. All of these are non-lethal paint rounds even if the knives have a special coating that will rub off to show a hit. So don't worry about that when picking your weapons. You and the hero students will both have comms that link to the staff here at UA, so we'll make the call for how much damage is lethal. Once you're dead, you're out of the game, obviously, but we do have very rooms so it's not going to be too boring for you. Same if the heroes arrest you, but there's a grace PRD there. You'll have 24 hours to escape before getting turned over to the teachers, so you better work quick, you dig. Denki frowned. The heroes weren't supposed to kill people, were they? Alright, that's the big stuff out of the way. Present Mike grinned. Once we get into the city, you'll have until noon until the heroes get here, so if you have anything you don't want to get caught doing, get it done quickly. Remember though that you're not allowed to actually grab any of the objectives until the heroes are actually inside the city. You got it. There was a quiet grumble of assent and Present Mike grinned. All right then, follow us to the buses and let's get on our way. The minute they arrived at the gates, all the villains scattered in every direction. Izuku and Hitoshi ducked into a building just inside the gates, and as soon as they found a room with a door that could actually close, Izuku dropped down cross-legged on the floor and pulled out his laptop. Hitoshi took off his jacket and stuffed it into his backpack. You'll be reaching out through my comms, right? As soon as I gain access, yeah. Izuku nodded, not looking up from the screen. The hero comms will obviously be able to communicate with each other, not just the teachers, so it's probably just a setting that I'll be able to mess with once I hack into the system. It should be easier than hacking the main school, thankfully. Hitoshi shrugged, taking off his combat pants and revealing the ripped jeans underneath. From what I know of Ned's personality, he'll make it possible for people to hack in for exercises like this, just to see if anybody will be crazy enough to try it. Izuku grinned. I guess it's a good thing that we're a little crazy then. Hitoshi pulled on a Hawks t-shirt over his armored undershirt and did a little spin. How do I look? Like a civilian. Izuku nodded in satisfaction. Good luck getting our weapons. I'll call you when I get our comms up and running. Hitoshi left him to his hacking and hurried out onto the street. Hitoshi kept his hands in his pockets as he walked down the deserted streets, glad to see they'd been correct about most of the other villains rushing to stake out the objectives in the first few minutes. Once the heroes arrived in a couple hours, this would be one of the only safe places to be recognizable as a villain because the way the exercise was currently run, the civilians were definitely not on their side. They'd avoid it later, once they got their hands on some civilian tokens, but for now, this area had exactly what Hitoshi needed. Weapons. The pawn shop Izuku had told him to go to was at the bottom of a staircase in the middle of a dark alley, so about as shady as it could get. Hitoshi didn't bother knocking on the door before going inside. The most dangerous villains acted like they already owned everything and then worked to make that happen, so that's what he and Izuku were going to do. The man at the counter looked up as Hitoshi came in. Hello there. You're a bit younger than my usual clientele, but I'm not one to turn away a customer. I'm sure. Hitoshi said dryly. I hear this is the best place to get weapons. The man grinned. You heard right. You can call me Shiguro. What did you have in mind? The works. Hitoshi said smoothly. I need at least 4 handguns and an assortment of knives, but I've recently come into a little cash, so I'm looking forward to seeing what you've got. Shiguro grinned and straightened up a bit. Ooh, I always like a challenge, especially when it comes with deep pockets. He gestured for Hitoshi to wait and disappeared into the back room for a few minutes, which Hitoshi used to get a look around. There wasn't much to see, honestly, but that was as expected, and he ran through what he knew about the guy he was dealing with. He and Izuku had found a forum for past participants, and it seemed like everyone had something to say about this guy. From what he'd heard, this Ito guy seemed almost too good to be true. Because he was. Shiguro came back into the front with a large duffel bag. Here you go, kid. Tell me what you think. Hitoshi gave him a wary look before taking the duffel and looking through it. There was a variety of handguns, shotguns, and a sniper rifle, which would definitely come in handy, as well as a few knives and explosives, which they wouldn't need to buy if everything went according to plan, but it was probably a good idea to have them, just in case the job later went south. Overall, it seemed like a good start, and they could always steal more later if they needed it. Throw in a bit more ammo and we'll call it good. Hitoshi said. Hey, you've got a pretty good variety of goods here. How do you keep track of it all? Oh, it's my quirk. Shiguro said. I have an insanely good memory, so everything I have and everything I get goes right up here in my big old brain and stays there. A lot less risky than keeping physical copies lying around for the police to find. Hitoshi nodded. Yeah, that makes sense. So there's no physical record of what I'm buying. I just want to make sure, in case you try going to the police or something. What? No, there's no copies. Shiguro put a hand on his heart. I would never. Hitoshi smirked as he took control. Good, that makes things easier. Forget you ever had any of the items in this duffel bag and forget I was ever here while you're at it. Wait for 3 minutes after I've left before waking up. He left Shiguro slack-jawed at the counter and slung the duffel over his shoulder. Haru Shiguro, a pawn shop owner that appeared in the exercise every single year. His son was apparently participating in the exercise this year as a student, which was the only reason Hitoshi knew that he wasn't lying about his quirk, but it's not as if father and son were on opposite sides. From what the past participants had said, going to him was only a good idea if you planned on getting arrested the first few days. Somewhere on day 3 or 4, he'd turn traitor for the heroes and give them, from memory, everything they needed to track down every villain he'd sold to. It was a good thing that memories were finicky things. There was a slight sound of static in his ear and Hitoshi winced as Izuku's voice came through a bit too loudly. Datoshi? Hitoshi? Can you hear me? Loud and clear, Izuku. Tayoshi groaned. A bit too loud, actually. Oh, sorry. Izuku continued speaking at a much more comfortable volume. I have your next targets. Are you done at the pawn shop? Yep. Hitoshi hefted the duffel, knowing that Izu was probably watching him. Feel free to delete the footage of me coming and going, that guy won't remember I was ever there. Good. Izuku was quiet for a short moment. Done. Okay, are you ready for your target yet? Hitoshi readjusted the duffel. Yeah, shoot. He could practically hear Izuku smiling. Okay, so go to the main square. There's going to be a guy in his early 20s with pink hair. He's your target. Kyoko wandered the streets and walked into a cafe as she tried to figure out her first move. Despite it just being a training exercise, UA and HUC had turned the training grounds into a practically bustling city for the week, and she got the feeling that for the civilians, it was basically just life as normal. There were grocery stores, cafes, even theaters that were just going about their daily operations, so it was a good thing that each of the villains had been given a handful of cash to get them started. They were obviously expected to just steal more later, but the time before the heroes arrived was for setting up, not committing crimes. She was feeling kind of hungry, so she decided to stop at a cafe she passed while she waited. She got a few weird looks for her outfit, but nothing more than she usually did on a normal day, so she didn't really care. The line was really long, so she had a lot of time to think as she made her way to the front. She closed her eyes and both felt and heard one for all humming under her skin, slowly syncing with her heartbeat. It was both louder and somehow quieter than she'd expected, and it almost felt like the power was trying to whisper so that it didn't hurt her ears. It would have been sweet if that was actually possible, but no. Kyoko was pretty sure it was all in her head. There was no way a power could whisper. Hello there. A middle-aged woman smiled at her. What can I get for you? A red bean cake? Kaika browsed the menu. And a boba tea, if that's all right. Coming right up. The cashier pressed a few buttons. Token. Kyoko frowned. Token. Oh, most of the little shops in the exercise have us tap that little participation token they gave you at the start, you know, that little disc they gave you when you showed up. That's kinda how we check that you're a part of the exercise and not some intruder. Plus, it helps the company track which places are popular and what to bring back next year, so we always try to scan them. I'm surprised you don't remember that from Orientation. Yeah. Kyoko frowned and pulled out her token. It seems like it'd be pretty important. She put her token down on the counter and the mood immediately shifted. If she hadn't known all these people were paid actors, she would have thought they were actually panicking. The cashier looked genuinely terrified as she stared down at Kyoko's red and black token. It's a villain. The lady cried out, a glint of challenge in her eyes as she watched for how Kyoko would react. Somebody call the heroes. Denki resisted the urge to restlessly pace back and forth. Remind me why we're just waiting? Because the beginning of this exercise is going to be a bloodbath. Mom explained. The minute that the heroes set foot inside the city, it's open season, so it's going to be a race to see if we can get the objectives before the heroes can get to us. Got it? Kenda, Denki looked down at the bank. But why are we camping out so early? The heroes won't be here for another 2 hours. Because we're racing the other villains. Mom laughed quietly. Look over there, see anything odd? Denki frowned and looked where Mom was pointing. Sure enough, there were people hiding in the shadows on the building next to them, just like they were hiding in the shadows on this rooftop. So, we're not gonna have to fight the heroes, Denki gulped, but we are gonna have to fight them. Mom grinned. Bingo. Denki took a deep breath and thought about those two terrifying kids he'd seen at the orientation. Oh, joy. Nedzu watched with interest as the Midoriya child drafted an email to the event coordinator for the HUC team using an email address that was just one letter off from his own. It was a brilliant piece of social engineering, but why did the boy want there to be a faux charity event on day 3? Was he trying to lure the heroes? That wouldn't help much if it was just him and his friend against an entire class of heroes. He wasn't about to interfere and risk not finding out the boy's plan. It was impressive that he had hacked into Nedzu's system so quickly. Honestly, it was impressive that he had tried at all, but his purple friend had been correct in assuming that Nedzu had made the exercise network significantly easier to hack into than UA itself. Still, it showed a considerable amount of skill, and even though there were definitely areas of his technique that needed polishing, he got the job done. He'd singled out 2 seemingly random civilian files, and Nedzu was still trying to figure out what he planned to do with them. He had a few suspicions, but it was more exciting at this point to see how things played out naturally. He was already intrigued, and the heroes hadn't even arrived on site yet. Spectacular! A lot of the villains are already waiting for the heroes to come in. Cementos pointed out. It's a smart play. It'll give them an advantage if they can pull off a robbery in those first few minutes. And it looks like one of the middle schoolers has already gotten themselves into trouble. Aizawa sighed. Predictable. Come now, Aizawa, be fair. All Might insisted. It's not as if the villains were warned about their tokens proclaiming their status. They were warned, actually. Midnight said. It was just in the fine print and not in quite so many words. Plus, they're different colors. Aizawa said. It's only logical to assume we'd use them to separate them and tell them apart from the civilians in the game. I'm interested to see how she deals with being targeted like this. Gran Torino had insisted on attending to make sure young Jiro was alright, which Nedzu had immediately approved. Hopefully, he'd be able to give a good example to All Might on how one should teach as well, because it had come to Nedzu's attention that he still had a ways to go before he was ready for next year's classes. The heroes aren't there, so the best move would be either to rob the place for extra cash, if she's committed to the villain role, or just to turn tail and run. Both are decent options. I'm more concerned about those 2 Shadows kids. Midnight said. They've decided to divide and conquer, it looks like, but they don't have burner phones yet, so there's no way to communicate with one another. Nedzu hid his grin behind his teacup. His teachers hadn't noticed that Midoriya had spent this entire time gaining access to the system. They would definitely be surprised when they realized that Midoriya was using their own comms to communicate. That was the thing about humans, they were always making assumptions about how the rules were supposed to work. It was going to be delightful to see them all proven wrong. Kyoka froze as the entire cafe turned on her. The heroes weren't there yet, but they were trying to make this simulation as real as possible, so there was still a possibility that police or even a vigilante might show up. She needed to run, but the only problem was that there was a crowd of people blocking the door. She needed to get them out of her way, like 5 minutes ago. Her heartbeat was rocketing out of control, and it gave her an idea. Her eyes flicked around the cafe until she saw a speaker, and she immediately shot out her earphone jacks and plugged herself in. Before anyone could stop her, she projected her heartbeat, but the speaker didn't have enough power to blow anyone out of the way. The people in the cafe were getting even more defensive than they had been before and were becoming just as anxious as she was. Her heartbeat beat a little faster as it echoed loudly through the cafe. This wasn't good. We need to get her. Now. One of the civilians cried out. When do the heroes get here? Not for a couple hours. Someone yelled. We need to take care of this ourselves. Kyoka's heartbeat increased again, and within a few minutes, the mob surrounding her was even more frightened, and that pushed them to be even more aggressive. This was just an exercise. Why were they acting so aggressively? She unplugged one of her earphone jacks and swiveled it around to listen to everyone's heartbeats and froze. Everyone's heartbeat was in sync with hers. Kyoka's eyes widened. She'd read a paper once that the human heartbeat will often change to match strong music or another person's heartbeat if they're near enough. Was that what was happening? There was only one way to find out. Kyoka took a deep breath and focused on calming down and slowing her heart rate. The effect was almost immediate. She'd always had some control over her heartbeat, but it seemed oddly easier today, and the mob actually did calm down in sync with her as she slowed the rhythm she was projecting. She gulped and focused on projecting a calming beat as she turned slowly to the cashier. "I'm just here for some food. Give me a pastry and let me be on my way." The cashier's eyes were hazy as she grabbed somebody else's order and handed it to her. "You seem like a nice young lady. Have a good day." "Okay." Kyoka turned back to the mob the crowd, now that they'd all calmed down. "Clear me a path to the door, please." There were some nods as people agreeably stood aside, and Kyoka considered her next move. It probably wouldn't take long for them to snap out of it once she stopped projecting her heartbeat, so that she unplugged and booked it, not stopping until she was down the street and around the corner. Her heartbeat had risen again, but she wasn't projecting it, so the only person affected was herself as she clutched the paper bag to her chest and sunk down against a brick wall. What the heck just happened? Hitoshi put his hands in his pockets and sauntered through the square while keeping an eye out for his target. He'd stashed most of the weapons somewhere safe and kept one knife and one handgun hidden away, just so he didn't look too suspicious. There was a lot of pink-haired guys wandering around today, and he sighed and discreetly pressed his comm. "Izuku, I need a bit more of a detailed description." "Oh, right," Izuku's voice said. "Okay, he's the one sitting at the fountain. His name is Hiroshi Tamida, by the way." Hitoshi looked over and, sure enough, there was a guy with pink hair sitting at the fountain. He smiled. "Better. Thanks, Izuku." "No problem." Izuku responded. "Good luck." Hitoshi nodded and made his way toward his target, clearing his throat when he got close enough. Hi. Do you know any good places to eat around here?" Tamida huffed in annoyance. "Well, if you bothered to look around." Hitoshi took control with a smile. "Walk beside me." Tamida stood up like a puppet, and Hitoshi nervously walked beside him, slinging an arm around his shoulder and keeping up a stream of nonsense conversations so they looked like two friends despite the stilted way that Tamida was walking and his blank expression. This was the most risky part of their entire plan. If someone were to pay attention to them or recall them acting suspiciously and tell the heroes. Finally, they got out of sight of the street, and Hitoshi breathed a sigh of relief. "Hey, sorry about this, dude, but I'm gonna need your token if I want to pass as a civilian." He pulled out the gun, making sure the silencer was attached correctly before he took aim. It took him a surprising amount of mental effort to actually pull the trigger. Even though he knew it was just a paint gun, he was still taking this guy out of the game permanently, and it felt real. After a long moment, Hitoshi took a deep breath and fired at his heart. The silence in the viewing room was deafening. Did he just? Mick's jaw dropped and he looked at the others in shock. Is he allowed to do that? The heroes haven't arrived yet. That guy isn't one of the official targets. Snipe pointed out. Therefore killing him ain't an objective, and normal crimes ain't technically disallowed before the heroes arrive. Yeah, otherwise that Jiro girl would have been disqualified for stealing breakfast. Midnight said. I still want to know how she did that. I know her file says she can project her heartbeat, but that was something else. My only question about Shinso is why? Aizawa leaned forward. Why kill a random civilian before the heroes have even arrived? I'm surprised you haven't figured it out yet, Aizawa. Netsu said in delight. But perhaps this will help. He projected Tamida's file onto the screen, and the teachers watched in shock as the file changed before their eyes, Shinso's face and name replacing Tamida's within just a few seconds. I believe we need to officially inform Tamida that he is now deceased. Netsu smiled. And I suppose congratulations are in order for Shinso on his civilian disguise. Tamida staggered back and looked at Hitoshi incredulously. Oi! What the heck, dude? Sorry. Hitoshi said sheepishly. Can you hand over your token now? What? Tamida paused and listened to his comm, then burst out laughing. I can't believe you seriously just killed me. The exercise hasn't even started yet. Yeah, well, I kinda need to steal your identity before the heroes get here. Hitoshi shrugged. So, got your token? And thanks for being so cool about everything, by the way. No problem. Tamita flipped his token like a quarter and made Hitoshi catch it, which he did. I mean, Endeavor's my favorite hero, so people being JRKiss doesn't really bother me. Ouch. Hitoshi deadpanned. Thanks for the vote of confidence. Tamita laughed. Okay, but you better win this. If you're forcing me out of the game this early, you have to at least have something to show for it. Hitoshi grinned. Oh, don't worry. We will. Izuku breathed a sigh of relief. After completing Hitoshi's file just minutes after their first kill, he'd pointed out another target and now they had 2 civilian tokens and the files to match a whole hour before the heroes were set to arrive. Perfect. Okay, Hitoshi, I'm gonna change out of my villain gear and try to find us a place to live for the week. Izuku said. Can you get us groceries and meet me there? Sure thing, Izuku. Hitoshi responded. And we're sitting out the mad rush at the beginning, right? Well, not sitting out. Izuku said slowly. Hitoshi sighed. We're watching the whole thing via the cameras, aren't we? Izuku smiled. Well, how else are we supposed to get to know our competition? Mom smiled as the clock struck noon, the exact time that the heroes were set to arrive in the fake city. Okay, Sparky. It's go time. They jumped off the roof and Denki looked over to see the rival group of villains they'd seen earlier doing the same thing. Mom grinned. I'll take care of these guys, you go in and hold up the cashier. Denki gulped. What? Just use your electricity and threaten them a little bit. Mom shrugged, her own hand coated in electricity. It's just like the movies, I believe in you. Denki exhaled slowly. Okay then. Good luck. Mom smiled. You too, Sparky. Knock him dead. Denki gave a jerky nod of affirmation and ran through the glass doors of the bank, his entire body sparking. This is a robbery. Give me all your money. He winced at how stupid he sounded, but the teller leapt into action and started shoveling the money from the register into a little bag. They probably knew they'd get robbed in the first few minutes. Once the money was in the bag, the teller tied the bag shut with a ribbon and Denki noticed a little badge hanging off it. It was around the size of his hand and emblazoned with a large number 8. That must be how they identified the objectives. The teller shoved the bag onto the counter. Just take it. Don't hurt us. Did you get the money, Sparky? Mom came bounding through the door and her eyes zeroed in on the bag of cash. Good work. Yeah. Denki nodded and gave her a thumbs up as she grabbed the cash. Easy as pie. Good. She looked out the window as there was a giant crash down the street. Now for the hard part. The heroes are here. Kyoka largely ignored the heroes as she made her way around the city, her villain token firmly hidden in her pocket. She still couldn't figure out what had happened back at that cafe. How had she even done that? She'd never been able to control others using her heartbeat before, so it must be a new development because of One for All. She'd thought that it was supposed to make her punch stronger, but apparently it had manifested in a different way than it had in All Might. She took a deep breath and ducked into an alley as a group of heroes ran past her. She wasn't too worried about the actual objectives at the moment. She had her own objectives to complete, namely, figuring out this new ability before she actually had to fight anyone with it. She should get some portable speakers, but she'd have to find a place that didn't ask for her token. Or she'd have to steal them. Kyoka huffed. Of course she'd have to steal them. Speakers, however, weren't always very subtle. If she was projecting her heartbeat, there was a chance the heroes would be able to block her influence with earplugs. If she could figure out a way to do it quietly, then she might be able to get what she needed without actually fighting for it. She waited until the heroes were out of sight before stepping out of the shadows and walking up to the nearest civilian, an older woman who seemed nice, but also seemed like someone Kyoka could overpower in the case of an emergency. Unless she took after Recovery Girl, in which case, it had been a good run. She jogged up to the woman and focused on calming her own heartbeat. Hello. How are you? Oh, I'm fine, sweetie. How are you? The woman smiled, but she didn't have that blank quality the people in the cafe had had, so Kyoka assumed she was just choosing to be nice, not being forced into calmness by her quirk. she'd have to try something else. I'm fine. Kyoka slowly snaked one of her earphones over and jabbed it into the woman's arm, immediately focusing on projecting a calming heartbeat. I need your help with something. The woman struggled for a moment, but calmed down almost immediately, her eyes taking on the blank quality that meant her emotions were now under Kyoka's control. Of course, sweetie, what can I help you with? Kyoka swallowed thickly and looked around. Actually, that'll be everything, thanks. She unplugged and ran. The woman sat there dazed for a few seconds before letting out a blood-curdling scream. Villain! It's a villain! Where are the heroes? Oh crap! Kyoka rushed down an alley and focused on stealth and keeping to the shadows as she hurried away. Okay, so that worked-ish, now to find an electronics shop. Nijire was feeling a lot of emotions right now, but most of all, she was excited. Sure, Tamaki might be nervous about fighting the fake villains and Mirio was concerned about stopping as many villains as possible, but Nijire was mostly thinking about how exciting this all was. They fought villains during their work studies, of course, but never all together as a class, so all she could think was how much fun this was gonna be. Their class was an interesting mix. Aizawa had expelled a lot of them during their first year, or at least demoted them to general studies, so they'd ended up with some transfer students from other schools or from different departments. As long as they had the determination to be true heroes, Aizawa could work with them, but if they didn't, well, Nijire was just happy that she and her friends had made the cut. Their class president had taken charge and sent half of them to protect an objective right from the start, while the other half had gone to the fake hero agency to get everything set up. Nijire and her boys had gotten sent to a museum and she and Amajiki had both been hoping that they'd have some time to browse through the exhibits first, but no luck. As soon as they'd arrived, the alarms had started going off and Mirio had had to phase through the wall in order to stop two villains who were trying to steal a vase. Nijire and Tamaki had caught up to him quickly, of course, but by that time, Mirio had already managed to corner the two against a wall. They took their places on either side of him and got into battle stances. The two men, who were similar enough they could be brothers, looked at each other and one of them grimaced. We're gonna have to run, aren't we, Ichiro? Yeah, Jiro, we are. Ichiro sighed. We're not allowed to use trigger in this exercise, so there's no way we'll be able to lift this huge thing after we activate our quirks. What are you talking about? Mirio smiled. Aren't you here to give us a fight? Ichiro laughed. No way. We're just here to annoy Eraser and make sure he doesn't forget about us. Yeah. Jiro laughed. Here, catch. Tamaki barely managed to transform one arm into a tentacle and catch the vase before it shattered. When Nidri looked back toward the villains, they were gone and the only thing she could see in their place were two little grasshoppers running on two legs. Eat our dust. One of them screamed in a high-pitched voice. How to jump. They both jumped over the heroes' heads and were out the door before Nijire could even wrap her head around their quirks. They would never be able to keep track of something so small long enough to give chase. Tamaki sighed. Well, at least we got the vase. But I wanted to catch them. Nijire pouted. What even is this thing anyway? It looked like any fancy terracotta vase, but instead of a scene from mythology painted on it, it was a giant hashtag. Nijire smiled as she remembered what Power Loader had told them about each of the objectives having a number, so we just need to protect this from the other villains. Mirio nodded. Yeah, we'll take it back to the agency so it can be better defended. It's definitely the second objective. How many were there again? For the villains? 13. Tamaki shuddered. But they get extra credit for any heroes they kill. Mirio grinned. Well then, we just won't let them kill us. Denki's eyes widened as a hero came barreling into the bank and grabbed both of them with tentacles that were growing like hair out of his head. He immediately started struggling against the hold, which just made the hero smile. Hey man, that's not gonna work. I'm Ogawadado, sorry, I don't really have an official hero name yet. But anyway, I'm here to stop you. Just follow my lead, Sparky. Even though she was as trapped as he was, Mom grinned. Eat our sparks. She electrified herself and Denki only hesitated a moment before doing the same. The hero seized and stumbled back, loosening his tentacles just enough that Denki could wriggle his way free. Mom bolted out the door and Denki shoved the objective under his arm as he scrambled after her. It didn't take long for the hero to recover from their joint attack, not nearly as long as Denki had expected, and they only had a few seconds head start down the street before he was chasing after them. Denki could see the other villains from earlier watching them from the surrounding rooftops and gulped as he gripped the objective a little tighter against his body. If this was what being a villain was like, why would anyone choose that? They were surrounded by enemies on every side. Who wanted to live like that? One of the villains was absolutely huge and Denki caught a glimpse of him throwing himself off the roof and onto the hero. Denki didn't look back to make sure the hero was alright, though, because he was too busy worrying about the other two villains, a man and a woman, who had just dropped down to block their path. He skidded to a stop beside Mom, who was already in a fighting stance staring down their new opponents. "I'd give up now if I were you fellas." Mom smiled. "You couldn't beat me earlier, you can't beat me now. We weren't trying our best earlier." The woman smirked and pulled out a dull knife coated in red paint. "But now that your boy there did the work of getting the objective, it's a different story. Toss me the bag." Mom said without looking at him. "We'll split up and meet at the rendezvous point, got it?" Denki nodded quickly. "Okay. Go." He tossed her the bag, but before she could catch it, a gust of wind picked it up and carried it toward the male villain. "Got ya." "Oh," Denki said quietly. "Well, that's not good. Electricity quirks, most likely related, and the ages point to a mother-son duo." Izuku muttered under his breath. "Fairly standard strength enhancement. I wonder if it's like fat gums and has to do with body weight. Something to do with knives and an obvious wind manipulation. I wonder how far that goes." Hitoshi shook his head as Izuku muttered to himself. They had managed to find a nice apartment for themselves without too many neighbors, and so far no one had noticed that they weren't supposed to be there, which was good. The other villains were running around completely unaware that Izuku was tearing apart their quirks, though the cameras and Hitoshi was doing his best to do the same with their personalities. The electricity quirk users would be hard to turn against each other, but he might be able to do it if he took control of one and gave just the right orders. Making them fight each other in general would also be effective emotional manipulation, so there were plenty of things he could do. The heroes had managed to arrest a couple of the minor villains right off the bat. The ones with the grasshopper quirks had gotten away, and it still remained to be seen who would end up with the bank objective and if any of those villains would actually get away. If anyone did, Hitoshi was betting on the older of the two electricity users. She seemed to have the most fighting experience out of everyone there. Hitoshi had doubted that the heroes would actually take the objectives to the agency, but the trio who had protected the vase had immediately decided to do just that, which meant that their plan was on track. Hitoshi glanced over to Izuku and sighed. Nobody but Izuku was crazy enough to come up with that plan. Jiro hadn't taken part in the initial rush either, but that didn't mean that she'd just been sitting around. She'd been looking for something as far as Hitoshi could tell, and she'd been camped outside in tech store for a few minutes now looking for a mark. At least, that's what Hitoshi assumed she was doing. She kept looking at the people passing by and almost approaching them before chickening out. She somehow still managed to keep mostly out of sight, which meant that no one had noticed her suspicious behavior, but she needed to act quickly and do whatever she was planning soon, or else she was going to get caught. A young man a few years older than them walked by her hiding spot, and Jiro took a deep breath before strolling out of her hiding spot, carefully looking as normal as possible as she trailed after the guy. When he was almost at the store, he suddenly went rigid before relaxing, and Hitoshi leaned forward to get a closer look at the screen. It was hard to see, but it almost looked like Jiro had stabbed one of her earphone jacks into his hand, but he couldn't be sure because it wasn't a second later that they started moving, him walking right beside her the whole way. "Hey, Izuku, can you get me any visuals inside the electronics store?" Hitoshi asked. "I think Jiro's making a move." Sure." Izuku absently pulled up the cameras and went back to watching the other villain fights. "Tell me if she does anything interesting." Hitoshi nodded and watched as Jiro walked with her victim through the store, picking up some high-end speakers before whispering something to the guy and walking up to the counter. She didn't have to say another word. The guy flashed his token and paid for the speakers, and Hitoshi's jaw dropped as he realized that she was somehow controlling him though her earphone jacks. "Hey, Izuku, I think you're going to want to see this." He pointed to Jiro, who was simply walking out of the store with her victim like nothing was out of the ordinary. "I'm not the only brainwasher here." "Really?" Izuku watched for a moment and then started muttering again. "This is perfect. If we can convince the police and heroes that she's committing your crimes, then we won't have to be as careful. Not that we won't be careful in the first place, obviously, but it'll give us some leeway." He trailed off and started scribbling in his notebook. Hitoshi kept watching as Jiro got partially down the street and then yanked the speakers out of the guy's hand and started booking it as her victim screamed. He winced. By the way." Hitoshi grimaced. "She might need a little more quirk training." The guy with the wind quirk smirked at them as he tossed the objective up and down. He was too far away for Denki to hit with his electricity, but it looked like Mom had it covered. She ran forward, hands already sparking, until the woman with the knives threw one at her face. She managed to dodge, barely, but had to turn to fight the woman instead of the stupid guy who was now running away with the objective. Denki looked back toward the hero, who was still fighting that big guy, and swore. It looked like it was up to him. He bolted after the wind quirk user, who suddenly stopped when he ran into a crowd of people. Denki didn't have time to stop before barreling into him. It took him a split second to think to activate his quirk, which gave Wind Guy an opening to throw the bag over to Big Guy, who caught it. The hero, though, responded by wrapping him up in his tentacles, and he had to wriggle out of them to toss the objective again. Mom shoved Knife Lady to the ground and jumped to catch it, then threw it to Denki. "Run, Sparky." Denki almost fumbled the bag, but managed to catch it just barely and ran as fast as he could. He skidded around the corner and grinned. He'd done it. He'd gotten away. There was a burning pain in his lungs and Denki stumbled to a stop, completely unable to breathe. What was happening? Was he dying? Was this a medical emergency? Had he punctured a lung? He collapsed onto the ground, dropping the objective as his fingers lost the strength to grip it. What was going on? "That was a pretty good shock there, Sparky," a voice said, and Denki tried gasping for air as Wind Guy knelt in front of him and grabbed the objective. "Too bad my quirk is air control, huh? It works on the air in people's lungs too, as I'm sure you already figured out. I'll let you breathe in a minute, but, I'll be keeping this for safekeeping, okay?" He winked and disappeared into the darkness at the end of the alley. Denki had no idea if the time after was actually a minute, but if it was, it felt like the longest minute of his life. His vision was starting to go dark before he felt air flooding back into his lungs again. He coughed and gulped, desperately trying to get enough oxygen. At some point he felt a hand rubbing his back and his mom's voice trying to calm him down, but it was kind of hazy. After he finally managed to get his breathing under control again, he looked up to see Mom looking at him in concern. "Are you okay, Sparky?" I'll get back to you on that." Denki rasped. "Wind Guy got away." Mom nodded. So did the lady with the knives. The big guy got caught by the hero though. "Let's hurry and get away while he's still busy with the arrest." Denki nodded and shakily got to his feet. Why would anyone want to be a villain? Izuku concentrated on looking as lost as possible as he reviewed the state of the exercise so far. Of the 13 objectives, 3 had been claimed by the villains in the initial rush, 1 was in progress, and 2 were currently safe in the hands of the heroes. He ran through the list in his head. Snitch, unclaimed. Vase, at Hero Agency. Hostage, unclaimed. Diamond claimed. Drugs, claimed. Weapons, claimed. Explosives, unclaimed. Bank claimed. Ransom, in progress. Convenience store claimed. 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 Documents, at Hero Agency. The claimed objectives were the easy ones that just required going in and stealing something without any need for information or special materials. The rest of the objectives all had something getting in the way, but Izuku and Hitoshi specialized in overcoming obstacles, so rather than being intimidated, they were just excited. So of course, they had decided to go after the most challenging objective on the first day. Izuku held back a smile when he saw his target around the corner. Ryu Hanzo. A transfer into the hero course from general education, his quirk was similar to Gang Orcus in that it gave him the head of a great white shark as well as the ability to do anything a shark could do, which meant that as long as he avoided the teeth and didn't get him near any water, Izuku would be fine. Hanzo's hero costume was simple, basically just a short-sleeved wetsuit with a blue and green wave design running up the sides, and Izuku could think of a few improvements right off the bat, but he wasn't here to fix the heroes' costumes or give them suggestions for improvement. No, he was here to absolute decimate them. Izuku purposefully made his way through the crowd toward Hanzo until he got close enough, then started running, "Mr. Hero! Mr. Hero!" Hanzo turned and looked down at Izuku. Hi. Can I help you?" "Oh," Izuku put on a worried expression, grateful he looked a couple years younger than he was. "I'm lost. Could you maybe help me find my way home?" Immediately, Hanzo smiled and Izuku held back a smirk. Helping a lost child was one of the hero's objectives, so too bad Izuku wasn't actually a lost civilian. Well, not bad for Izuku, but bad for Hanzo. "Sure, kid." Hanzo puffed out his chest proudly. "Just tell me where you need to go and I'll get you there." Izuku gave him the fake address and Hanzo nodded and pressed his comms. "Hey, guys, I'm just helping this lost kid find his way home and then I'll be back on my normal patrol, okay?" He didn't say anything else and Izuku relaxed slightly. If he'd given the other heroes the address or even the neighborhood they were going to, that would make things a bit more complicated, but as long as he didn't give them any more information than he had, Izuku could still proceed as planned. The two of them weaved their way through the streets until they reached a place a lot less busy and a lot more abandoned. Izuku acted appropriately confused at street corners and let Hanzo help him as much as possible, but soon enough, they still ended up exactly where Izuku had planned. He waited until there were no witnesses before calling out, "That's it. That's my building." Izuku started running and Hanzo jogged after him. "You kinda live way out there, don't you?" Hanzo panted. "Well, if you're found I should probably be heading back." Hanzo was getting nervous, which meant that Izuku was running out of time. He skidded to a stop. "Actually, there was one more thing." "I guess that's okay," Hanzo said, tensing slightly. "What is it?" Izuku channeled his inner fanboy as he grabbed his notebook and shoved it forward. "Can I please have your autograph?" Hanzo relaxed and took the notebook. "Really? I've never had somebody ask for my autograph before. This is kinda cool." Izuku waited on the ball of his feet until Hanzo looked down to sign the notebook, and then he struck, punching Hanzo directly in the nose. He dropped the notebook, stumbling back and giving Izuku just enough of an opening to target his pressure points. They were bound to be a bit different on someone with shark anatomy, but if he focused on the places where his body was more human and hit hard enough in just the right places. "Hey, what are you?" Hanzo's eyes rolled back as Izuku punched his pressure point. "Ow." He fell to the floor and Izuku waited tensely for a few seconds to make sure he was really out before running forward and flipping the switch that would functionally break Hanzo's calm. He'd still be able to talk to the teachers, but not his fellow heroes. "Sorry, I need you alive for now." "Okay, where did I stash that rope?" Hitoshi perched on the windowsill and watched the pair of villains below. It was a girl with pigtails and a guy with green-gray skin and horns that looked large enough to pulverize both Hitoshi and Izuku if they made the wrong move, and that was without a quirk that made his fingers shoot out bullets. The duo had also managed to nab the diamond objective in the first few minutes of the exercise, thanks half to the girl's drill hair quirk and half to pure skill. From what Hitoshi had seen of their heist, he suspected that they had some past experience on the wrong side of the law, even if it wasn't enough to disqualify them from the exercise, and Izuku had agreed. Normal civilians didn't know how to drill through a safe that fast. He took a deep breath as he ran through the character that he and Izuku had discussed for Shadows. He needed to act like he already knew everything and let them know that, no matter what they did, he would always come out on top. Hitoshi made sure his voice changer was on securely before speaking. "Nice place you've got here. Dark, musty, perfect villain vibes, but then again you'd know all about that, wouldn't you? The labs weren't very heavily guarded, unless the 10 layers of security alarms and weapons systems counted. A villain would immediately trip every single alarm and call a giant security team, not to mention every hero in the area, but Izuku wasn't a villain at the moment. He held his breath as he swiped Hanzo's hero license at the front gate, grinning when the keypad beeped and turned green. The rules of the exercises stated that the license wouldn't work anymore as soon as Hanzo died, but for right now, Izuku was a hero, even if he was currently dressed in full villain gear. He waited for the gate to open and strolled right in, careful to avoid any people running around. He'd already hacked into the system and looped the footage, just in case anyone was watching, but from his research, this facility was more of a shell that was supposed to look intimidating than it was an impenetrable fortress, and the security team were just more HUC actors, not actual security guards. It would still be a challenge to get in and out, of course, but if he wanted to be a scary hero, he needed to work on stealth anyway. It was good practice, and all he had to do was stay out of sight. A guard came around the corner and Izuku froze. So much for that plan. Hey! The guard's eyes narrowed. You're not supposed to be here. At Hitoshi's voice, both villains jumped to their feet and started looking around. The girl's hair twisted into drill-like points as her eyes swept the room, and the guy readied his hands to shoot as he called out into the darkness, "Who's there?" "Just a friend." Hitoshi took control as he jumped down from the window, landing in a crouch. "Now, if you agree to be nice, I'll let go of Mr. Frankenstein here and we can have a friendly chat. If you don't, he'll attack you. Got it?" The girl glanced between Hitoshi and her partner, tensing when she realized the latter was just standing there, eyes blank and limbs hanging loosely at his side. She cursed, "A brainwasher? Of all the rotten luck." "Yep." Hitoshi hummed, "Well? Have you come to a decision?" "Fine." The girl snarled. "Let him go and we'll talk." Hitoshi grinned and let go. "Good, now let's get introductions out of the way. What are your names?" The two exchanged a nervous glance and the girl looked at Hitoshi suspiciously. "Just cut to the chase. We know you're after the diamond." Hitoshi held up his hands in surrender. "Actually, I'm not. At least, not right now." "Now your names?" The girl hesitated for another long moment. "Akiko." "Maki." The guy answered. "Good. Now that wasn't too hard, was it?" Shinso said. "Now let's talk business." Akiko crossed her arms. "No. Fair is fair. Tell us your name first." Hitoshi's social anxiety was going through the roof, but he forced himself to look. He was used to acting cocky to get a rise out of people and throw them off, so it was familiar in a way that was almost comforting. The longer he acted intimidating like this, the more he actually found himself having fun, which was something he hadn't necessarily expected, but he wasn't about to look a gift horse in the mouth. No, it was more fun to just roll with it. Hitoshi made a show of thinking. "How about you call me Shadows? That's as good as we're gonna get, isn't it?" Maki laughed. "All right, Shadows, so if you're not after the diamond objective, then what are you after?" "Oh, just trying to make some extra cash on the side." Hitoshi shrugged. "So how would you like to know who the snitch is?" "You're an info broker." Akiko sighed in realization. "I heard some rumors they were planning to add one this year." Hitoshi nodded, half wondering if Izuku had started those rumors himself, but couldn't get too distracted. He could always ask Izuku later. "So? Would you like the info or not?" "Yes." Maki nodded. "How much?" "How about 1/10 of what you get from turning the objective in?" Hitoshi offered. "Either that or a favor." "We'll pay the money," Akiko said dryly. "We really aren't interested in owing any favors to someone like you." "Suit yourself." Hitoshi shrugged and tossed them an envelope from his pocket. "Pleasure doing business with you." He strolled out the front door of their hideout and couldn't keep a smile off his face. He liked feeling powerful. Izuku saw the guard reaching for his comm and panicked. This mission, in fact their whole plan, relied on him getting in, getting the objective, and getting out without being noticed. Before he had the chance to hesitate, Izuku pulled out one of his guns and shot a paintball at the guard's chest. "Sorry, but I can't let you call for backup." There was a second when Izuku couldn't be sure if it had worked, but then the guard sighed and took out his token, dropping it onto the floor. He didn't say anything else and neither did Izuku. He looked around for a moment until he found what looked like a garbage chute and then picked up the token and shoved it inside. That would count as hiding the body in accordance with the rules, and one of Ectoplasm's clones would soon be there to pick up the dead guard, so he was free to move on. He gave a brief nod to the guard before stashing his gun and continuing on his way. He had to pass 3 more security checkpoints on the way down to the basement, but none of them were manned and he didn't run into any more guards. He reached the final room and swiped Hanzo's hero license to open the door, whistling when he saw the sheer amount of experimental explosives that were inside. A large badge with a number 7 was stuck to one of the 3 pallets and Izuku grimaced, "On a change of plans, we're gonna need to steal a truck." Once he was a safe distance away from the villain's hideout, Hitoshi called Izuku on the comms. "Hey, I'm done passing along the info on the snitch. Is there anything else you'd like me to do before I head back to the apartment?" Give me a minute." There was a noise that sounded like an engine starting and Izuku cheered under his breath before responding, "Sorry, I had to figure out how to hotwire a car." Yeah, since this job is going to take a little longer than I'd planned, could you go take care of the hero I stole the license from earlier this morning?" "Sure thing," Hitoshi said. "You set it up so I can track his hero comm from my phone, right?" "Yep," Izuku said. "There's gotta be a forklift around here somewhere to just make sure you call before you kill him. If I'm still inside the lab when his license deactivates then the game is over." Hitoshi nodded. "Got it? No pressure." Izuku snorted, "Pretty much, yep. I mean, I have a plan B in case one of us gets caught, but still that okay, I found a forklift so I gotta go." "Good luck." Hitsuhei rolled his eyes and started looking around for a place where he could change back into his civilian clothes. "Do I even want to know? They've weaponized the exercise." Aizawa groaned. "I know." Nedzu chirped back. "Isn't it delightful?" "That's one word for it." Aizawa took another sip of coffee and sighed. "I don't think we've ever had fake villains try to become info brokers before." "There was 1 year," Midnight said, "but they ended up eliminated by the first night and their info wasn't even very good anyway. So nothing like these 2 young uns." Snipe chuckled. "If they're in the system, they definitely know who the snitch is and probably where they are too. Pretty easy to put that in an envelope." "But why help the other villains?" Mike asked. "They're basically giving away objectives. Maybe they don't think they can get the objectives themselves?" 13 suggested. "They are just kids after all. Just kids that successfully kidnapped a hero and are in the process of stealing enough explosives to level a city block." Cementos said. "I think we might have underestimated them." Aizawa snorted. "You think? There's one more option I don't think we've considered." Nedzu sipped his tea. "These boys seem to be rather cutthroat, don't you think?" The teachers blinked and looked at each other for a long moment before Mike cleared his throat. "You think they plan to betray the other villains?" "It's not a bad plan." Aizawa hummed. "Let the others deal with the high security and the heroes, then steal the objectives back. If they can pull it off, it might just be less work than going after the objectives themselves." Nedzu nodded. "Exactly." Snipe shook his head. "That's gotta be against the rules somehow." "Nope," Nedzu said happily. "Everything they've done has been perfectly legal, keeping in mind the loopholes, of course." "Of course." Aizawa rolled his eyes. "And who put the loopholes there?" Nedzu took another sip of tea. "Why, Aizawa, I have no idea what you're talking about." Hanzo woke up with a headache and groaned. The last thing he remembered was helping that lost kid and him asking for an autograph, and Hanzo's eyes widened and he tried to stand up only to fall flat on his face. That dumb kid hadn't just tied his Fritz behind his back, of course not. That would have been too easy. No, he'd gone through the trouble of tying his ankles together too. Hongzhou struggled fruitlessly for a few minutes before giving up and looking around. He was trapped in some sort of closet, but his captor had at least had the decency to leave a box fan in there to give him some airflow. He did his best to press his comm against his shoulder to activate it. "Guys? Team, come in." There was nothing but static in answer, and Hanzo's stomach sunk as he realized that kid must have done something to it. How had he even gotten into this situation? They'd gotten the villain files a full week before the exercise, and all the hero students had practically memorized them so that they wouldn't be caught off guard. If that kid had been in the files, Hanzo would have recognized him. Maybe he was just working with the villains and wasn't actually one himself. But if that was the case, then he would have hesitated before taking down a hero. So he probably was a villain, but which one? Hanzo racked his brain for a moment before he finally half-remembered one of the files they'd been given. They hadn't given much thought to it at the time because there wasn't as much info in it to memorize, but now that he was sitting here, tied up in a closet with plenty of time to think, he was starting to wonder if maybe they should have paid more attention to the Shadows file. His captor had green hair and eyes, and from the one, singular, photo they'd been provided, there was one kid with green accents on his outfit, so it wasn't too big of a leap to guess which one he'd just fallen prey to. Hanzo slumped against the wall with a groan. Wonderful, just peachy. Can anybody hear me? Help. Hitoshi checked his phone again and made his way into the abandoned apartment building. There were scuff marks along the hallway, and Hitoshi winced as he realized that Izuku must have had to drag the hero at least part of the way there. They'd both gotten a lot stronger since they met, but most of their training had been geared towards stealth, not strength. Not that he was really trying to be stealthy right now, of course. But Hitoshi wasn't too concerned, considering that there was no one else around and he could already hear the hero yelling down the hallway. At least he was in the right place. That kid is in for a rude awakening. Cementos said. I bet he thinks he's about to get saved. Yes. Nedza hummed. The Shadows have the advantage of being able to disguise themselves as civilians. It comes in handy. Yeah, that's the only reason they were able to nab Hanzo in the first place. Snipe pointed out. They'd also taken the time to read the heroes' objectives. Aizawa added. They knew exactly what to bait him with to get him into an isolated area. True. Mike frowned. Hound Dog? I think you might need to pencil this kid in for a session after this. Hound Dog nodded. I was thinking the same thing. Hanzo's voice was starting to go hoarse, and he really was considering just giving up. He'd tried his comms at least a dozen times and had gotten static again and again, and the way he was tied up meant that there was no way to reach the ropes with his teeth, so his only option was to hope that there was a civilian in the area who would hear his yells and come cut the ropes. He hadn't thought it was very likely. The Shadows kid had obviously put a lot of thought into this abduction and made sure that no one was around to see it, but he could still hope. He perked up when he heard footsteps coming down the hall toward him. Hey! In here. Help. The footsteps came closer and Hanzo grinned as the door finally creaked open. It was a kid with purple hair, probably around his same age, and Hanzo heaved a sigh of relief. Thank God, I've been here forever. I need to get out so I can contact my team. Can you just cut through these ropes? Then I'll be all good. The purple-haired kid frowned and tilted his head. I'm a little confused. Hanzo sighed, interrupting him. Look, I know I'm a hero and everything, but there was this kid and he pretended to be lost and led me here. Oh no, I know exactly how you got here. The kid crouched down so they were looking eye to eye. I'm just confused about why you think I'm here to save you? Hanzo's jaw dropped in horror and he remembered one very important fact. Shadows was plural. There was absolute silence in the watchroom. Eventually, Mike broke the silence. Okay, well that's just terrifying. It's psychological torture. Aizawa gave him a look. Of course it's terrifying. They're using fear to make sure their opponent stays off rhythm. Snipe said. I'd even say it's a half-decent strategy if their opponent weren't already tied up. I'm all for tying people up. Midnight held her hands up. But it does seem like poor form to traumatize someone you've already beaten. It's unnecessarily cruel. 13 agreed. Why taunt them like this? That was when Nedzu piped up, because they're actually thinking like villains. Izuku, behind Shinso's voice, Izuku could hear Hanzo screaming for help. Can I kill this guy yet? He's really loud. Almost. Izuku eased on the brakes, instead of accidentally slamming them like he had the first few times. He was lucky none of the bombs in the back had exploded already. He swiped the hero's license in the last keypad and carefully drove through the gate before tossing the license out the window. Okay, done. He heard a gunshot over the comms. Meet you back at the apartment? Izuku nodded. I'll drop these off and meet you there. Sorry about that. Hitoshi shrugged and took a step forward to help. Hanzo, who currently had red paint smeared across his chest. "Let me." "Sorry." Hanzo pulled at the ropes and snarled. "Sorry. Sorry doesn't cut it. You tied me up and—" "Technically, my friend tied you up," Hitoshi interrupted. "And now I'm here to untie you, so—" Actually, Hitoshi froze as an unfamiliar voice spoke in his ear. "I believe it's best if you leave that to me. Perhaps it's best if you're not in the area when my clones comes to collect him." Hitoshi gulped and backed away. That must be ectoplasm, the teacher responsible for collecting all the fallen players. If they didn't want him to untie Hanzo, that meant that they didn't trust him not to attack Ichitoshi even though he was now out of the exercise. And as Hitoshi looked at Hanzo snarling at him, he couldn't help but agree that that was the safer option. Yeah. Hitoshi nodded. "I'll leave him to you." There was a sigh on the other end as Hitoshi walked away. "Thank you for that, at least." Hitoshi got back to the apartment first, which was understandable considering that he had to drop off the bombs at a safe location. He sighed and sat down to browse some of Izuku's notebooks. The plan was simple as far as it went, but it involved a lot of watching and waiting for the other villains to make a move, which unfortunately wouldn't be happening until later tonight. Right now, pretty much everyone was either liking their wounds or celebrating their successes, and the heroes were too busy setting up their agency to actively pursue any of the villains. That would probably change tomorrow, but he and Izuku had the rest of the afternoon to do, well, whatever they wanted, really. The door opened and Izuku smiled as he walked in. "Hello. How did it go?" "The group we picked just assumed I was an info broker." The corner of Hitoshi's mouth twitched upwards. "I don't think they even thought I was a villain, just another part of the exercise." "Perfect." Izuku nodded. "That means we're still off the radar. I had to kill a guard at the labs, so unfortunately they'll know that somebody broke in, but I didn't leave anything that links it to us." "Good." Hitoshi flipped through another notebook. "Any plans for this afternoon, or just wait until the cover of darkness to see what strings we need to pull?" Izuku shrugged and pulled out his laptop. "I need to send a few emails real quick. I need to establish a pattern of communication with them so they don't have any reason to be suspicious when Nedzu starts giving them tips tomorrow. Other than that, yeah, we're pretty much free. Any ideas?" Hitoshi thought for a moment. "I've been thinking about Jiro. Didn't she say her quirk had something to do with enhancing her hearing?" "Yeah." Izuku rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "But then, from what we saw earlier, it almost seems like yours. It's possible she was just lying." Hitoshi suggested. "If her quirk's like, well, I've lied about my quirk plenty of times, but the truth always comes out eventually. It's also weird how little quirk control she has." Izuku thought out loud. "She doesn't seem to have experimented with it at all." Hitoshi grimaced. "Actually, that's pretty common with mind control quirks. Nobody wants to volunteer to help a future villain." Izuku grimaced too. "Right. Yeah." Hitoshi sighed. "I was thinking that she did help us pick out our outfits. Maybe we should return the favor with a few tips? I know we're planning on working alone, but it'll be useful to have allies for the first few days." Izuku nodded. "Let me just finish this email and I'll track her down." Mirio smiled as they finished setting up their mock hero agency. He knew it was just an exercise, and they'd all done internships and work studies before, but it was still cool that the teachers were letting them loose on this. Before, they always had someone looking after them and holding their hands, but right now, it was just them against the villains, just like it would be for real someday. It was exhilarating. Amajiki didn't feel the same way. Now that the groceries for the week were put away, he was hiding in the pantry while Nijire waited on the counter, swinging her legs. "Oh, come on, Amajiki. Cheer up. We won our fight. The villains ran away." Amajiki said piteously, his voice half muffled by the door. "If they hadn't, we could have lost." "Nah, they ran because they knew we were too strong for them to beat." Mirio flexed. "We're gonna do great, just you wait and see." The door opened and Amajiki poked his head out as two of their classmates walked in. Shiguro Shin and Akane Kahaku had both transferred from the support course last year, so they were the ones who had been assigned to set up all the techie stuff like the agency's command center. When he saw them, Amajiki's eyes widened and he slammed the pantry door closed. Oh no, we're being hacked. Kahaku rolled her eyes, the literal copper wires that made up both her hair and her quirk bouncing as she shook her head. Why do you always jump to the worst conclusions, Tamaki? We're not being hacked. Amajiki poked his head out again. We're not. Of course not, silly. Nijire giggled and hopped off the counter. These people aren't real villains or anything. Mirio nodded in agreement. So, what's up? Netsu sent us a message. Shin said. He was a bald boy with pointed ears whose quirk let him find any object he'd touched. We were going around and collecting everyone who's here so we can read it together. The three of them followed their classmates to the big room they'd set up as their case of operations. Pretty much all of their classmates were there by now, sitting around the table, with the exception of a handful who were still out on patrol. Shindo, a kid with an earthquake quirk who had transferred from another hero school, looked around the table and frowned. Hey, has anyone seen Hanzo? I thought he was supposed to be back from patrol by now. Last I heard he was helping a lost kid. Kami, another transfer student, said. But that was a couple hours ago, so he should totally be back soon. Shindo shrugged. He can read it when he comes back. The rest of us are curious now. Fine, let's just do this. Kahaku projected Nedza's email up on the wall. Now pay attention, everyone. Dear students, congratulations on surviving the first day of the exercise. I and the other faculty are proud of your efforts thus far and are looking forward to seeing how you stop the villains in the coming days. Good luck. UA Principal. Kyoka had no idea what she was doing, but she wasn't about to admit that. So what if One for All had given her an entirely new ability that she hadn't even considered? That didn't mean she had to freak out much. Now that she had a minute to relax, the significance of what she'd just done was hitting her like a truck. She just controlled people, like straight up played their emotions like a guitar. It was as cool as it was terrifying, and now she had less than a week to master her new ability, all while pretending to be a villain, going after objectives, and somehow making All Might and Gran Torino proud. Wonderful. She had currently found an empty apartment to hide in. It didn't have any furniture, but it didn't have neighbors either, which meant that there was nobody around to turn her in. She'd learned her lesson about that the hard way. She was also getting hungry, but even with her new ability, getting groceries would be a challenge. So far, every time she'd used her emotion control, she'd ended up having to make a run for it, and that was going to be fairly difficult with a bunch of bags. The speakers had been hard enough. She did not want to try that with eggs. She froze when she heard footsteps out on her balcony. Nobody even knew she was here, and she couldn't think of any other reasons that someone would be traipsing across balconies. Was it a hero coming to arrest her? She got into a fighting stance and stared down the curtains until they started moving, and then stabbed blindly with her earphone jacks. Whoever was on the other side of the curtain grabbed them both and started wrapping them around his hand as he walked into the room. Midoriya was grinning as he emerged from the curtain. So you could hear us coming. I was starting to wonder if you'd lied about your quirk. Kyoka tried to yank her earphone jacks out of Midoriya's grasp, but he was holding on tight. Shinso just looked bored as he pushed aside the curtain and walked inside. Ah, is that any way to greet your old friend? Kyoka narrowed her eyes suspiciously. I thought you said we were enemies during this exercise. Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean we can't form alliances. Midoriya said, taking a closer look at her earphone jacks. For example, we don't want to get on the wrong end of these and you need help with quirk control. Kyoka stopped. How? How did you know that? We know a lot of things. Shinso gave her a teasing smile. So, new quirk development, or did you just not practice? Kyoka raised her chin stubbornly. I'm not sure what you're talking about. Suddenly, her brain went foggy and Shinso's smile went wide. Relax. All the tension left her body before she even had a chance to realize what was happening. Midoriya let go of her earphone jacks and he and Shinso exchanged knowing glances. It was only a few seconds and then her brain cleared as Shinso dropped his control. I'm talking about that. Shinso looked almost nervous, but covered it with a small smirk. Although, I'm betting yours works a little differently. You, Kyoka was a little breathless. You can control people too. And you need help figuring out how to do that better, Midoriya said. So what do you say? Truce. Kyoka frowned. What do you get out of it? Shinso rolled his eyes. Izuku really likes quirks. Midoriya chuckled awkwardly. Guilty. I just really want to know more about how your quirk works. Jiro sighed. You and me both. Izuku grabbed his notebook and sat down on the floor. Okay, so the whole controlling people thing is new, right? Yeah. Jiro said nervously. The first time it happened, I was trying to do something else, but then I realized that people were reacting to my heartbeats, so it's more heartbeat control than pure brainwashing. Shinso nodded. How does it work? Well, Jiro gave him a look. People react to my heartbeat. Izuku's eyes widened in excitement. With how the human nervous system works, that means that you can make people nervous. Or calm. Jiro shrugged. That's about all I've tried so far. So why do you always run as soon as you use your quirk? Hitoshi asked with a smirk. Because it only works as long as I'm plugged in. Jiro complained. As soon as my heartbeat's not influencing them anymore, they snap out of it. So, the first thing we need to do is figure out a way to prolong your influence. Izuku hummed. You mostly try to leave while your victim is calm, from what I've seen. Wait, from what you've seen? Jiro's eyes narrowed. Have you been watching me? Of course I've been watching you. Izuku frowned. I thought that was obvious by now. Anyway, you usually leave when the victim is calm, but have you tried making them nervous before you go? No, Jiro said dryly, because that usually leads to them attacking me. Izuku's not talking about just a little anxiety. Hitoshi sighed. He's talking about launching a full-blown panic attack so that by the time you leave, your victim doesn't know which way is up. That, Jiro gulped. That seems a little intense. Well, yeah. Hitoshi shrugged. But nobody's ever fond of brainwashers, and we're practicing these techniques to use against villains. They aren't nice, so why should we be? Think about it. Izuku added. With your hearing, I'm sure you've practiced at least a little bit of stealth. You sneak up on your victim, get them to do what you need them to do, then leave them too disabled to chase you. Jiro hesitated for a long moment. I'm not using it on civilians. Of course not. Izuku smiled, pulling out a burner phone he'd picked up on the way there. You'll be using it on heroes. Denki was charging their burner phone when it buzzed. He frowned and opened the message. Mom, who's Nedzu? Mom immediately jumped. Only the principal of UA. If he's the one texting us, then it must be really important. Denki shrugged and read aloud. Hello there. I hope the exercise is treating you well. I couldn't help but notice that your boy has plans to attend UA, and I thought you might like to know that there will be an interesting learning experience for him at 9 o'clock tonight in the old toy warehouse. Perhaps there might be an objective up for grabs there as well. You never know. Anyway, have a wonderful evening and good luck. He set down the phone. Is he even allowed to give hints like that? He's the principal, of course he is. Mom grabbed the phone and reread the text. Plus he's got a reputation for manipulating things behind the scenes, so I'm not surprised. I guess he's taken a liking to you, kiddo. Really? Denki grinned. That's good, right? Very good. Mom smiled back. Well, what are we waiting for? We've got plans tonight. You're really just going to let that kid keep impersonating you like that? Mike asked incredulously. Half the teachers were giving Nedzu significant looks, but he was just smiling and watching it all unfold. Aizawa rolled his eyes. Yeah, right? Like the rat would really pass up an opportunity for prime entertainment like this. Oh come now, it's not purely for entertainment's sake. Nedzu tooted. I simply don't believe in interfering with a valuable learning experience for our students. Translation, you want to see what happens next. Midnight grinned. So do I. It's not every day a couple of kiddos manage to trick a pro. Snipe sighed. These young'uns are a different breed. Yes. Nedzu chirped happily. Yes they are. Kyoka followed behind Midoriya and Shinso as they made their way through the warehouse. She knew it was just to set the mood, but the rows of broken-down toys were definitely creepy. Midoriya glanced around and turned to her. Can you hear anyone else here? Kyoka shook her head. it's just us. So far. Hitoshi corrected. This place is gonna be crawling with people pretty soon, so we better find a good hiding spot. Kaikoa sidestepped a broken jack-in-the-box and shivered. Why are we here again? Because it's the handoff point for the ransom objective. Izuku answered. A villain managed to kidnap the target during the initial rush, but we can ignore the victim, she's not the objective. The money is. So there's going to be a trade? Jiro asked. And we're going to swoop in and steal the money. Midoriya and Shinso exchanged a significant glance and Midoriya hesitated before answering. Yes. Kyoka huffed. There's something else going on, isn't there? Midoriya smiled. Of course there is. Okay. Kyoka held in her frustration. So what is it? That's for us to worry about. Shinso smirked. Don't worry, it's all part of the plan. Kaikoa glared at them. You know, you two are really starting to get on my nerves. Why are you always so cryptic? That just means it's working. Midoriya answered, which didn't clear anything up at all. Now come on, we've got two different groups of villains, plus a group of civilians showing up. We gotta find a good place to watch. They climbed a rickety set of stairs up to landing and Shinso picked the lock to what was probably supposed to be an office space, but was really just a medium-sized room with a desk. It had a medium-sized window that overlooked the rest of the warehouse and Midoriya frowned as he looked at the glass. Well, that's not gonna work. Yeah, no. Can't snipe through that. Shinso pulled out his gun. You might want to cover your ears. Kyoka hurried to cover her ears as he aimed at the glass. There was a loud bang and Kyoka flinched as a paintball exploded against the glass, splattering red paint all over it, but not breaking it. The three of them stared at the window for a long moment before Shinso broke the silence. Well, that didn't work. You were trying to break the glass, right? Kyoka asked. Yep. Midoriya walked over to inspect the window. Well, it made a few cracks at least. Kyoka covered her ears against as Midoriya took out a knife and rammed the butt end of it into the window where the bullet had hit. It took longer than she would have liked, but eventually the window shattered with a crash. Midoriya put away his knife and shook out his hand. Good enough? Shinso nodded. Good enough. Denki and his mom arrived at the warehouse just before the time Nedzu had given them. He wasn't sure what exactly was going to happen, but he did know that there was going to be an objective up for grabs. That meant, however, that there were probably going to be other villains. So Sparky. Mom grinned. We're here. Where do you want to? She was cut off by a loud crash from inside the warehouse and they exchanged a quick glance before dashing inside. Denki looked around, ready to fight whatever heroes or other villains might come at them, but nothing happened. Nobody came rushing at them or tried to attack them, probably because nobody was there. Oh. Denki straightened up. That was weird, right? Mom nodded. Very. Come on. We should hide before everyone else arrives. Denki followed, but couldn't help but wonder if everyone else had arrived already. Izuku, Hitoshi and Jiro ducked behind the wall under what was left of the window, panting as they listened to the pair of eclectic villains find a hiding spot. That. Izuku swallowed. That was way too close. I don't know why it's such a big deal. Jiro said. Aren't we waiting for those other people to arrive? First of all, Izuku raised his finger. The timing's not right. Second of all, that lady is not the kind of person we want to fight head-on. Jiro raised an eyebrow. Why not? Well, Izuku's been digging up whatever he can on everyone involved in the exercise and that woman, Hitoshi whispered, is a pro-hero in her daily life. Jiro paled, which Izuku thought was the appropriate reaction. The only reason he'd felt confident enough to even invite them was because there was going to be so much else going on and it would give them a chance to take her out of the game as early as possible. Now that they'd potentially lost the element of surprise. Dang it. Izuku muttered and pushed himself away from the wall. The meeting's happening any minute, Izuku. Hitoshi hissed. Where are you going? Izuku grabbed his phone to call in reinforcements. So, Nijire asked, do you think any of the big bad villains will be making a move tonight? I hope not. Tamaki shivered. But with our luck, almost definitely. I dunno, it's been kind of a slow patrol. Mirio pointed out. The three of them had been walking the streets for about an hour now. So far they hadn't run into any villains at all. Mirio figured they must all be laying low and planning their next moves. It made for a nice quiet night. Mirio felt his phone vibrate in his pocket and dug it out. Who's calling me this week? Everybody knows I'm busy doing the exercise, even Sir. It must be a spam call. Nejiri shrugged. Or a villain. Tamaki added unhelpfully. Oh, stop being such a worrywart, Tamaki. Nijire said. Answer it. Mirio shrugged and picked up the call. Hello. There was a long moment of silence on the ether end. Hello? Is anyone there? Is this Lemillion? Mirio blinked in surprise, then grinned. Yep. You've got the right guy. What can I do for you? There's a villain fight at the toy warehouse. The voice hesitantly whispered. Come quickly, please. What? Tamkai and Nijiri looked at him curiously, but Mirio just shrugged. Who is this? Someone who wants to help. The voice sounded young and was choked with tears. Please. They can't find out that I'm helping you. The kid hung up and Mirio frowned, putting his phone back into his pocket as he turned back to his friends. So who was it? Nejiri asked. I don't know. Mirio answered thoughtfully. But I think we should head to the toy warehouse. Denki couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Maybe it was that crash earlier, or maybe it was the fact that Mom was still being hypervigilant. Either way, it was kinda creeping him out. There was a moment near the doorway and Denki peeked out from behind a pile of boxes. A small group was walking in, looking around the apparently empty warehouse with suspicion. One of them, a balding man with a suit, was clutching a large briefcase with a number 8 emblazoned on the front. Mom grinned and poked Denki in the ribs. It's go time. What? Denki exclaimed quietly. But the hostage isn't the objective. Finished for him. The money is. We already have one unknown group here. Let's not wait for more enemies to show up. Mom leapt out from behind the boxes, with Denki close on her heels. Izuku sold and jumped into action as soon as the other villains moved. He'd been hoping that the villains would show up first and give them a little bit more time to prepare, but apparently they weren't that lucky. He exchanged a look with Shinso and they both leapt into action. Izuku grabbed a gun from his side and saw Hitosai doing the same thing beside him. They just needed to keep Electra from getting the briefcase for now. Everything else could wait a few minutes. Jiro saw what they were about to do and slammed her hands over her ears just before the two of them stood up and fired through the broken windows. Their aim wasn't excellent, but it was good enough that they were able to at least hit the guy carrying the objective. A few seconds later, he dropped both the briefcase and his token. Electra turned to look up and Yuku and Hitoshi ducked behind the wall as electricity arced over their heads. Hitoshi grabbed Jiro's hand and pulled her along as they all started running. Denki's eyes widened as the air filled with paintballs. None of them hit him, thank goodness, but the civilian holding the briefcase went down in seconds. Mom at least had the presence of mind to throw some electricity at whoever was shooting at them and the bullet stopped after that, so Denki assumed she must have hit whoever it was. He made a mad lunge for the objective, but the door slammed open with a bang and he stumbled. Everyone looked toward the door to see a villain with rose vines growing out of him standing in the doorway, looking at the chaos. The hostage in his arms looked terrified but unharmed and Denki was momentarily relieved before he remembered that he was supposed to be the villain here, not the hero. He lunged for the objective again but was stopped as one of the vines wrapped around his ankle and pulled him back. He yelped when his electricity lit the vine on fire and he scrambled back as quick as he could before the villain could recover. I'm gonna go after the shooters. Mom yelled. You hold down the fort here. Okay. Denki nodded in determination. You can count on me. Mom smiled. That's my boy, I'll be right back. Izuku stopped in his tracks as he heard Electra yell, they're splitting up. Looks like it. Hitoshi nodded, and I can practically see the gears spinning in that big ol' brain of yours, so spit it out. What do you have in mind? Izuku looked around. Well, it's gonna take all of us and... He was cut off by a shout. Heroes are here, everybody scram. Izuku grinned, perfect timing. Electra hurried up the stairs and looked around. The room seemed mostly empty except for two boys at the far end. Those must be the shooters. She made a beeline toward them when she felt a dull stabbing pain on the back of her neck. She whirled around to see girl standing there, and she started charging up an attack when a voice stopped her in her tracks. "Do you know where your son is?" Her heart rate skyrocketed and she whirled back around toward the boys. The taller one had disappeared and Electra panicked. "What did you do to him?" "Nothing." The boy smiled and raised his gun. Yet, Electra couldn't move. Her heart was going 1,000,000 miles a minute, and all she could think about was all the different terrible things the missing villain could be doing to her son. She should never have left him. She hardly even noticed when the young man in front of her pulled the trigger. By the time Mirio, Tamaki, and Nijire arrived, the villain fight was already in full swing. There was red paint everywhere that looked eerily like blood, and the air was full of electricity and vines as the villains hashed it out. Tamaki steeled his limited courage as he tried to figure out what was going on. The villain with the thorns had a girl tied up in his vines, so Tamaki made her rescue his first priority. He manifested some octopus that he'd eaten that morning with his right hand and a glam shell in his left. The kidnapper only took his eyes off Tamaki for a second to see where Mirio and Niger were going, but it was enough for Tamaki to knock the villain over the head with the clam shell. The villain crumpled to the ground and the vines loosened just enough for Tamaki to pull the hostage to safety. Denki was feeling a little overwhelmed. When Mom had left, it had been him against the Rose villain, but now it was him, the Rose villain, and 3 heroes. Yeah, not fun. "Pust, over here." Denki jumped when he realized there was someone gesturing to him from the shadows. It was one of the boys he'd remembered seeing when they'd first shown up, the one with the purpose on his costume instead of green. And Denki froze. Was he trying to help him? "Come on," the kid insisted. "We gotta get out of here. Do you want to fight these heroes?" But Denki looked up the stairs where Mom had disappeared. "My mom." "My friends are heading to help her right now," the kid said. "But you can't help anyone if you're dead or arrested." Denki gulped, but only hesitated another second before running after the kid, who started weaving around the boxes almost faster than Denki could follow. It took everything he had just to keep up. "Calm her down," Izuku ordered. "Now that she's out of the exercise, we don't need to worry about her getting away." Jiro nodded and Electra gradually calmed down, blinking as her heart rate went back to normal. She blinked for a moment as she thought through what just happened, and she looked at Izuku in disbelief. "Did you really just kill me?" "I had to take you out early," Izuku explained simply. "A pro hero is just too big of a factor to leave in the game." Electra nodded in respect. "Smart. I hate it, but I can see where you're coming from. Now, the staff wants me to leave my token here, so..." Grabbed her token from her pocket and Izuku snatched it out of her hand. "I, actually need this." Electra frowned. "Why?" Izuku gave her a shaky smile. "I can't really tell you." She crossed her arms. "Why not?" Izuku pocketed the token and gestured for Jiro to follow. "Because you'd try to stop me." Tamaki looked over the hostage to make sure she was all right and then turned back to the fight. Nidra and Mirio had managed to subdue the other group that had been fighting the Rose villain, but the electric villain they'd seen earlier must have slipped away while they were all busy with the others. Guys," Tamaki yelled quietly. "I think we lost one." Kyoka ran a little ahead of Midoriya as they left the warehouse behind. That had been the most chaotic thing she'd ever experienced, but even so, Kyoka skidded to a stop when she heard a gun pee-pee behind her. "Midoriya, what are you doing?" "Making sure you understand the plan," Midoriya said simply. Kyoka hummed skeptically. "And why does that require pointing a gun at me?" "It's insurance, just in case you don't agree," Midoriya explained. "And so you know what will happen if you don't follow the plan." "Oh," Kyoka asked. "And what is the plan?" "You're not going to tell Sparky that we're the ones who killed his mom," Midoriya began. "Well, obviously not." Kyoka scoffed. "I thought Shinso was offing him right now." "No. He's more useful alive," Midoriya said thoughtfully. "A quirk like that has so much potential and I want to see what he can do with it." Kyoka slowly turned to look at him. "Then why not keep them both alive?" "Because I can't manipulate a pro hero," Midoriya sighed. "At least not for long." Her son, however, is a different story. So you're going to use him? Kyoka asked. And then what? That depends on how long he stays useful. Midoriya shrugged. We told you before the exercise even began that we didn't care who we stabbed in the back. Yeah, and you weren't lying. Kyoka sighed. So what? If I tell him you killed his mom, you'll kill me? Yep. Midoriya smiled. And since he won't listen to us if he knows, then you'll kill him too. Kyoka finished. You're not giving me much of a choice here, are you? Well, Midoriya gestured to the gun. You do have two options. Kyoka thought for a moment. She might be able to control him into letting her go, but Midoriya had eyes everywhere and it wouldn't take him long to find air again. And that was only if she could get away in the first place. He seemed to know how her quirk worked even better than she did, so he probably had already come up with a way to counter it. It seemed like a JRK move to lie to Sparky like that, but at the same time, why was she here? Her main goal, really her only goal, was to practice using One for All and learn how to use it better, so it only made sense to stick around as long as she could and get advice from the crazy quirk analyst, even if he was currently threatening her with a gun. Plus, she was supposed to be acting like a villain anyway, right? So, Midoriya prompted. Are we on the same page? Kyoka deflated. Yeah. Now can we get going? We're wasting time. Okay, did we accidentally hire middle school mob bosses? Mike threw his hands up in the air. Like, where did we even get these kids? They volunteered. Aizawa shot back. They look like they're having fun, at least, Midnight pointed out. Cementos grimaced. I'm not sure that's a good thing. Look at how easily they took out a pro hero. If they decided to become real villains. Well then, it is a good thing they've applied to our hero course, then. Nedzu chirped. Aizawa groaned. Problem children. Toshinori listened to the exchange nervously. He was starting to regret approving young Jiro's participation in the exercise. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like a terrible idea for the future symbol of peace to pretend to be a villain for a week. He had thought that she wouldn't be too impacted by it, seeing as she was a future hero, but this villain duo, Shadows, had come out of nowhere and knocked the entire plan off the rails. He tapped on Gran Torino's shoulder nervously and gestured toward the hall. The old geezer rolled his eyes, but followed Toshinori when he stood and left. He could feel Nedzu's curious eyes on them, and that made him as nervous as ever, but he was the symbol of peace. He wasn't about to be stopped just because the principal might judge him. The door snapped shut behind them and Gran Torino crossed his arms. So, Toshinori, what is this about? We're missing the show. I'm concerned about young Jiro. Toshinori answered honestly. I think we should instruct her to pull out of the exercise. We can't do that and you know it. Gran Torino shook his head. What? You can't stand to see your successor threatened. You know that as a hero she'll face danger all the time. It's not that. So it's those boys. Gran smiled teasingly. The Shadows. They're corrupting her. Toshinori insisted. They're downright villainous. Which is what the exercise calls for. Gran held his hands up in surrender. Look, I don't know what those boys have planned or what they're trying to accomplish, but that green kid is a genius when it comes to quirks, and with her new quirk development, having a brainwasher to guide her is invaluable. Are you really considering taking her away from a resource like that? Toshinori sagged his shoulders. Why did it have to be brainwashing? It's so. Stop right there. Gran interrupted. If you judge her or start calling her a villain just because of the manifestation of the quirk that you gave her, then you may as well quit your job as a teacher now. You nothing. Gran punched his arm. You've got a lot to learn about teaching and working with teenagers, got it? So why don't you sit back and learn something for once? You're right. Toshinori surrendered. Let's go back inside. Wasn't sure what to think of his new friend? Ally? Person who had saved him from a group of superheroes? Hey! Now that they were a street or two away from the fight, and his new companion had taken off his mask, Denki wasn't as afraid of actually talking to his rescuer. You never told me your name. The kid stopped running and gave Denki an appraising glance. You can call me Shadows for now. That's such a cool name. Denki grinned as Shadows almost smiled. Does that mean I'll get your real name later? Maybe. Shadows said evasively. You're Sparky, right? Denki blushed. That's just what Mom calls me. My name is Kaminari. Shadows looked around. The rendezvous point is just a little farther. Come on, let's get going. The others will be there soon. He started running again and Denki scrambled after him. So who are these others? Are they the same friends who are helping my mom? Yep. Shadows skidded to a stop and lifted up a manhole cover. This is the place. Denki gulped. This place is almost as creepy as you are, dude. I'll take that as a compliment. Shadows sounded like he was smiling. We had to find someplace the heroes wouldn't look. Shadows didn't say anything else, just jumped down into the tunnel and expected Denki to follow, but that just made Denki even more curious about the whole thing. Just who was this kid? He seemed around the same age as Denki, but Shadows just gave off this air of mystery that was just as intriguing as it was intimidating. Hey, do you know who was shooting at us earlier? Denki asked. That was pretty scary too. Shadows waited a moment before answering. There were people shooting? I think we arrived after that. Oh. Denki frowned. They're who my mom went after, so I was just curious. There was the sound of soft footsteps above them, and Denki tensed as someone removed the manhole cover. Two people dropped down, a shorter kid whose outfit matched Shadows and an attractive girl with purple hair. He waited a moment for his mom to drop down after them, but she didn't. Maybe Shadows had other friends who were helping her. He seemed cool enough that he must have tons of friends. How did it go? Shadows asked. Any issues? The heroes didn't see us, the boy reported. I never thought I'd be grateful for having to avoid bullies, but I gotta say, it's effective stealth practice. So you guys are Shadows' friends? Denki interrupted. So when are the others getting here? Shinso frowned. Others? Yeah, Denki said. The ones who were supposed to be helping my mom? The boy's face fell and he reached into his pocket. I'm sorry, the heroes. We just weren't fast enough. He took his hand out of his pocket and Denki's blood ran cold as he recognized his mom's token. They killed her? Heroes, especially young ones, aren't the best at controlling their powers. The boy grimaced. I don't think they meant to, but it was just enough for the teachers to call it a fatality. Denki took the token, but she's so strong. I'm sorry. Shadows put a hand on his shoulder. We need to get moving. Once the heroes finish off the villains at Tay Warehouse, they'll be coming after us next. Right. Denki wiped his eyes to get rid of the beginnings of tears and nodded. Shadows is right. We should get moving. Shadows? The girl slapped Shadows' arm. You only gave him your villain name? Shadows shrugged. He didn't need to know. The girl rolled her eyes. I'm sorry. These two like to call themselves Shadows, but they also enjoy being needlessly ominous and mysterious all the time. The tall one is Shinso and the short one is Midoriya. Don't get on either of their bad sides. Oh, and now who's being needlessly ominous? Shadows, Shinso shot back. What can I say? Jiro smiled. I learned from the best. Now let's get out of here. Mirio was tired by the time they got back to the hero agency. They'd figured out that most of the people they'd taken down weren't villains at all, but instead civilians who had gotten caught up in a hostage situation, so they'd probably get points docked for that. They had managed to take down the Rose villain, but even after searching several blocks surrounding the warehouse, they weren't able to find the electric villain or the one who'd shot up the place. All that and they only had one arrest and an objective to protect. It was okay though, that's more than they would have had without the anonymous tip. So Mirio supposed they had a new ally going for them as well. Guys. Thank goodness you're back. Shin ran up to them as they walked in the door. We found Hanzo's token. He's dead.